48 hours after my sister poured red wine down the front of my dress at her wedding, I was sitting behind my desk at work when my father's estate attorney called me. Daniel Reed did not waste time on pleasantries. "Megan, I sent Lauren written notice this afternoon. I will not prepare or endorse an accounting or distribution package that treats your father's debt to you as if it disappeared. Your claim has to be resolved or properly reserved before she can move forward with the plan she's been pushing." I stared through the glass wall of my office at people carrying boxes down the corridor, trying to understand how a wedding toast had managed to collide with probate in less than 2 days. 48 hours earlier, Lauren had stood in front of a ballroom full of people and announced that I had signed away my claim to our father's house. The uncomfortable part was that she had not completely lied. I really had signed something away. Before I tell you why my own sister needed me out of that ballroom before she raised her glass, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me, because the signature Lauren bragged about was real, but what she claimed it meant was something very different. And if you enjoy stories about families finally being forced to face the consequences of their own choices, subscribe to the channel and keep listening. 2 days earlier, on a cold Saturday in March, I had arrived at Lauren's wedding, determined not to give anyone a reason to talk about me. That might sound strange until you understand my family. My father, Thomas Walker, had been dead for less than 4 months, probate was still open, and my younger sister and I had already spent more time discussing furniture, bank statements, and the future of his house than either of us had spent talking about grief. Lauren had married Ryan Mercer in an upscale ballroom outside Columbus, elegant enough to feel special without pretending any of us belonged to some old money dynasty. There were candles along the tables, pale flowers everywhere, and a framed photograph of Dad near a small empty chair at the edge of the reception area. Every time I looked at that photograph, I remembered how much he would have hated being turned into decor. I had gone to Dad's house that morning because Lauren wanted a pair of our mother's earrings for the wedding. Mom had died years earlier, and Lauren had decided at the last minute that she wanted to wear them during the reception. I still had one of Dad's old brass house keys in the side pocket of my purse, the same key I had used through broken furnaces, flooded basements, forgotten medications, and 100 ordinary emergencies that had slowly made the house feel less like property and more like another family member. I found the earrings where I expected them, in a small velvet box in Mom's old dresser, and brought them directly to Lauren. She thanked me, kissed my cheek, and then looked past me toward the ballroom doors. "You're staying for all the speeches, right?" she asked. The question was casual enough that I almost ignored it, but Lauren had already asked me twice that week whether I planned to leave early. I told her I was staying through dinner and the toasts, and something in her expression tightened before her smile returned. Lauren and I had never been the kind of sisters who pretended we were best friends. We loved each other, or at least I believed we did. But love had never made us similar. She was 5 years younger, more social, more comfortable asking people for help, and far more invested in what a room thought of her. I was the person Dad called when the insurance company sent a letter he did not understand or when a contractor gave him an estimate that looked wrong. Lauren was the person he called when he wanted company. For years, everyone treated that difference as natural. Megan handled things. Lauren needed things. I had stopped arguing with the labels a long time ago because I had a career I liked, my own home, my own money, and very little patience for fighting over roles people had assigned us before either of us was old enough to question them. That did not mean I let Lauren walk over me. 2 years earlier, when her first home staging business was collapsing, she had asked me for money. I looked at the numbers she sent, asked her what she planned to change, and told her no when she could not give me an answer. She called me cold. Dad told me she was frightened. I told both of them that fear was not a business plan. We did not speak for almost 2 months after that, and I survived it just fine. So when people later decided I must have spent my life quietly sacrificing myself for Lauren, they were wrong. My mistake was not that I never said no. My mistake was believing that once I said no clearly enough, I did not have to keep defending what the word meant. The reception had been going on for less than an hour when Lauren approached me with a glass of red wine in her hand. I was standing near the edge of the dance floor talking to one of our cousins when she came close enough that I smelled her perfume before I heard her voice. She said my name. I turned, and the next thing I knew, cold liquid hit the front of my dress from my chest to my waist. The wine spread across the pale fabric in a dark red sheet. People around us stopped talking. My cousin sucked in a breath and reached for napkins, while Lauren stared at the stain for less than a second before looking directly at my face. "Go change," she said. "You're making a scene." I remember that sentence more clearly than I remember the impact of the wine. There had been no apology, no horrified gasp, no hand reaching for a towel. She had dumped half a glass down the front of me, and somehow I was the embarrassing one. My first instinct was anger, sharp and immediate, but anger did not make me stupid. I looked at the angle of the glass, then at her hand, then at the people watching us. Maybe she had slipped. Maybe someone had bumped her. I could not prove anything from one spilled drink. And I was not going to turn her wedding reception into a shouting match over something she could dismiss as an accident. I took the napkins from my cousin and pressed them against the fabric. "I'm not making a scene," I said quietly. "I'm standing here." Lauren lowered her voice. "Megan, please, just go change." There was something almost desperate underneath the irritation now. I looked at her for another second, picked up my purse from the back of my chair, and walked away. I did not cry. I did not storm through the ballroom. I did not give her the performance she seemed to expect. I headed toward the corridor beside the coat room, already thinking about whether I had anything in my car that could pass for another dress, when I heard Lauren's voice behind me. I had almost reached the turn toward the restrooms when Lauren stopped near the maid of honor. I could not see them clearly from where I stood, but I heard the maid of honor ask whether they should start getting people seated for the speeches. Lauren answered in a voice low enough that she obviously did not expect me to hear it. "Wait until she's gone." The maid of honor said something I could not make out. Lauren repeated herself. "Just wait until she's gone." I stopped walking. For a few seconds, all I heard was the music from the ballroom and the faint sound of dishes being stacked somewhere behind the service doors. The stain on my dress suddenly stopped mattering. Lauren had asked me all week whether I was staying for the speeches. She had checked again when I arrived. Then wine had ended up all over me shortly before the toasts, and instead of apologizing, she had immediately tried to send me away. One coincidence was possible. 2 made me uncomfortable. 3 made me curious. I went into the restroom, locked myself in a stall long enough to think, then moved to the sink and started blotting the wine with cold water. My hands were steady by then. That was one thing people often misunderstood about me. I did get angry. I simply did not believe anger deserved control of the steering wheel. I sent a short text to a friend who knew I was at the wedding and told her I was fine but still at the venue. Then I put my phone back in my purse and looked at myself in the mirror. The dress was ruined for the evening, but I was not. If Lauren needed me gone badly enough to manufacture a reason for it, I wanted to know what she planned to do once she believed she had succeeded. Instead of returning to my table, I moved farther down the service corridor until I found a spot near one of the ballroom entrances where I could hear the sound system without being visible from the main floor. Staff members passed me twice, and I simply told them I was waiting for someone before leaving. Nobody cared. From where I stood, I could see part of the head table through the narrow opening between the doors. Ryan was seated beside Lauren, looking tired but happy. I remember feeling almost guilty for what I was doing. It was his wedding, too, and whatever game Lauren was playing, I had no reason yet to believe he knew anything about it. The first 2 speeches were harmless. Ryan's brother told an embarrassing story about college. Lauren's maid of honor cried through a memory about how they met. Then Lauren stood. The room quieted almost immediately. She started by talking about Dad. That part hurt more than the wine. She talked about how badly she wished he could have been there, how he had loved family gatherings, how he had always wanted his daughters to have stable lives. Her voice shook in exactly the place where people expected it to. Guests lowered their eyes. Someone near my old table dabbed at her face with a napkin. I almost felt ashamed for hiding in a hallway with my phone in my hand. Then Lauren changed direction. She started talking about the house. She called it the place where we had grown up, the place where Dad had taught us what family meant, the place she and Ryan hoped to keep alive for another generation. That was when I opened the recording app on my phone. I still did not know what she was about to say, but I knew enough to stop relying on memory. Lauren raised her glass. "Dad left me the house," she said. "Megan signed her claim away." Applause rolled through the ballroom. I watched heads turn toward the chair where I had been sitting earlier. A few people looked confused when they saw it empty. Lauren smiled through tears as if she had just shared a tender family decision we had made together. Then she rested one hand on Ryan's shoulder and added that the house was finally theirs to build a future around. Ryan's reaction was small, but I saw it. His smile did not disappear, exactly. It hesitated. His eyes moved from Lauren toward the tables, and then back to her. I did not know what he was thinking, and I was not going to invent an answer just because I wanted one. I only knew surprise when I saw it. Lauren kept speaking, but I barely heard the rest. I was looking at the brass key in my open purse. Dad's key. For months after he died, that house had felt like a weight I wanted off my shoulders. Lauren wanted it. I did not. She wanted to preserve it, renovate it, build some version of her future around it. I had no emotional need to own half a house simply because our father had once lived there. That was why, in January, after weeks of arguments over furniture and property and what Dad supposedly would have wanted, I had signed a formal disclaimer, giving up my beneficial inheritance under his estate. Lauren had told the truth about that. I had signed it. I had known what I was signing. Nobody forged my name. Nobody tricked me with a hidden page. I had been told clearly that under Dad's will, if I disclaimed my share of the residuary estate, that share would pass to Lauren. I had taken time to think about it, and then I had signed anyway because I did not want the house, and I did not want to spend another year fighting my sister over things I could live perfectly well without. But inheritance was not the only financial relationship I had with our father. Long before Dad died, he had borrowed money from me. Real money. Enough that we had signed a promissory note. Enough that he had made monthly payments. Enough that after his death I had formally submitted the debt to his estate. My disclaimer had not withdrawn that claim. Lauren knew it because she had received the paperwork herself in her role administering the estate. And yet she had just stood in front of almost 200 guests and taken one true sentence: "I signed my inheritance away," then stretched it over everything else until the truth disappeared underneath it. I stopped recording when the applause ended. For a moment, I considered walking back into the ballroom exactly as I was, red wine stain and all, and asking Lauren in front of everyone whether she wanted to explain the difference between an inheritance and a debt. I could picture her face. I could picture the silence. A younger version of me might even have enjoyed it. But public humiliation would not answer the question that mattered. Why did she need everyone to believe the estate was settled when it was not? I stepped farther down the hallway and opened my email. Daniel Reed's name was already in my recent contacts because he represented Dad's estate. I attached the recording and typed one sentence. "Please put this with the estate file." Lauren is describing my disclaimer as if it erased everything. I read it twice before sending. I did not accuse her of fraud. I did not threaten her. I did not tell Daniel to stop anything. He was the estate's attorney, not mine, and I understood that distinction. I simply sent him a record of what Lauren had published. Then I walked out of my sister's wedding. The cold March air hit my face as soon as the doors opened. I sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine, still wearing the ruined dress, still carrying Dad's old key, listening to muffled music through the walls of the venue. I thought I would feel devastated. Instead, I felt something much quieter and more dangerous. Clarity. Lauren had not needed me gone because she was afraid I would deny signing the disclaimer. I could not deny it. My signature was real. She had needed me gone because she was trying to decide, in front of a room full of witnesses, what my signature meant. Late Monday afternoon, Daniel called me. After explaining what he had already told Lauren in writing about the unfinished accounting and the unresolved creditor claim, he paused. His voice changed slightly, becoming more careful. "Megan, I need to be clear. I represent the estate. I don't represent you personally. I understand. Then I need one factual answer before I decide what estate documents I can ethically prepare. I leaned back in my chair. Daniel asked, "Did you ever forgive or withdraw your father's loan?" I looked at the closed office door. Then, at the old bank folder, still sitting in my computer from the months after Dad died. "No," I said, "never." And that was the moment I realized Lauren's wedding toast had not ended a family argument. It had started one. Daniel waited after I said I had never forgiven or withdrawn Dad's loan, as if he wanted to make sure I understood the weight of my own answer. Then he reminded me of something I already knew but needed to hear again. He represented Dad's estate, not me. My written creditor claim had been formally presented to Lauren in December, copied to Daniel, and preserved in the probate administration before I ever signed the inheritance disclaimer. It had not yet been finally allowed or rejected, which meant Lauren was free to dispute it through the proper process if she believed she had a basis. What she could not reasonably do was prepare the estate for distribution as though the claim had never existed. The recording didn't create a problem, Daniel told me. It showed me Lauren may be describing an unresolved estate to other people as if it were already settled. I sent her written notice this afternoon. I won't prepare or endorse an accounting that simply makes your claim disappear. I asked whether that meant the house was frozen. Daniel immediately corrected me. Nothing had been frozen. Probate was continuing. Lauren still had all the rights and responsibilities the court had given her as personal representative. But the quick path she had been pushing toward a house distribution and refinance could not move forward on paperwork that treated an $83,000 obligation as zero. That distinction mattered to me. I did not want a magical victory because I had recorded one ugly wedding toast. I had sent Daniel evidence of what Lauren was saying, and the estate documents already contained the rest. On December 15th, less than 3 weeks after Dad died, I had formally presented the promissory note, proof of the original transfer, and his repayment history to Lauren in her fiduciary capacity. Lauren had received it. Daniel had received a copy. Nobody had been surprised. At least, nobody had acted surprised then. The fight only became useful to Lauren after I signed away my inheritance in January. "So what happens now?" I asked. Daniel said Lauren could acknowledge the debt, challenge it formally, negotiate a resolution, or make sure adequate funds were reserved while the estate continued. What she could not do was pretend my disclaimer answered a completely different question. I thanked him, ended the call, and had just started closing the files on my computer when Lauren's name appeared on my phone. I almost let it ring. Then I decided I was done giving her empty spaces she could fill with her own version of events. "What did you do?" she demanded before I could say hello. Her voice was low and furious, which told me she was somewhere she did not want overheard. I told her exactly what I had done. I had sent Dad's estate attorney a recording of her publicly describing an unfinished estate as if it were finished. "You signed it away," she snapped. I said, "I signed away inheritance." She answered, "Same difference," with such certainty that for half a second I wondered whether she had convinced herself. "Not to the money Dad borrowed from me," I said. The silence that followed was different from anger. It was calculation. Then she changed tactics. "You waited until 2 days after my wedding to do this to me." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the dark stain of evening spreading across my office windows. "Lauren, you brought it into your wedding. I didn't mention the house. I didn't make the toast. I didn't pour wine on anybody." She insisted the wine had been an accident. I told her I had not called to debate the wine. She said I was punishing her because I could not stand that Dad's house was going to her, and that was where I finally laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the accusation was so perfectly backward. "I gave you my inheritance," I said. "If I wanted the house, I had a very simple option. I could have kept my share." Lauren said I had known she cared about the house more than I did. That was true. She said I had told everyone I wanted to be done with it. Also true. Then she made the mistake of pushing one step farther. "You don't get to walk away and then come back when you decide there's money on the table." I stopped laughing. "The money was on the table before Dad died. You know that because I gave you the claim in December." She told me I was being technical. I told her. A debt is technical when you owe it. It becomes very emotional when you're the one expecting somebody else to forgive it. She hung up on me. The folder containing Dad's loan was still open on my computer after the call. I clicked the scanned promissory note, and the image took me back to his kitchen in October of 2024. That kitchen had never changed much after Mom died. Dad replaced the refrigerator, but kept the same scarred oak table, the same ceramic bowl near the window, and the same yellow legal pads he used for everything from grocery lists to insurance questions. When I arrived that afternoon, there was already a folder waiting at my usual seat. Dad did not ease into the subject. He told me the house had become expensive enough that selling it was starting to look like the responsible choice. The roof had needed work. The heating system had failed at exactly the wrong time. Mortgage and home equity payments had piled up alongside property taxes, insurance, and other obligations. He had enough retirement income to live, but not enough room in his monthly cash flow to correct everything at once without accepting a pressured sale. I opened the folder and found a draft promissory note on top. "You already wrote this up?" I asked. Dad folded his arms and said, "I know what you're thinking." I looked across the table at him. "Do you?" He gave me the tired half smile he used whenever he believed he had gotten ahead of one of my objections. "You think I called because you're the daughter who fixes things?" I did not smile back. "Am I wrong?" For once, he did not rush to defend himself. He looked down at the paperwork, rubbed his thumb along the edge of the folder, and said, "This time, I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking to borrow money, and I'm paying it back." I asked why the distinction mattered so much. He said, "Because I've blurred it too many times." That answer was honest enough to make me listen, but not honest enough to make me stop asking questions. I wanted to know the balance on the first mortgage, the home equity line, what was past due, what repairs had already been paid, what remained, and exactly how much he believed would stabilize things. Dad became irritated halfway through because he thought I was interrogating him. I reminded him that he was asking me for $92,000. "If you want daughter rules, ask me for dinner," I said. "If you want $92,000, you get lender questions." He stared at me for several seconds, then laughed, despite himself, and slid another stack of papers across the table. I had enough liquid savings to make the loan without touching my retirement accounts or borrowing against my own house. But that did not mean I intended to make a reckless decision. I spent days reviewing the numbers. I reduced what Dad initially wanted, insisted that he keep more responsibility for his regular expenses, and made sure the payment schedule was something his pension and Social Security could realistically support once the immediate pressure was gone. The $92,000 did not magically erase the mortgage or the home equity line. Part of it covered urgent roof and heating work. Part brought several house-related payments and taxes back into order. The rest cleared expensive short-term obligations that were squeezing Dad's monthly cash flow badly enough that he had begun considering a fast sale. Once those pressures were gone, his regular retirement income could carry the house again. I knew there was still debt attached to the property. What I did not know then was how some of that debt had begun. Dad described it as a series of bad financial decisions and house expenses. I believed him because he was embarrassed, and because at the time, I had no reason to think the explanation contained a hole big enough to matter. When we signed the note, Dad pushed his pen away and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "You can still say no," he said. I told him I knew. He nodded. "I mean it, Megan. I don't want you doing this because I'm your father." I answered, "I'm doing it partly because you're my father. That doesn't make the paperwork fake." He smiled at that, but there was sadness in it. "Good," he said. "Keep saying things like that." I asked what that was supposed to mean. He shook his head and said, "Nothing today." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Looking back, Dad had a habit of approaching the truth from the side, when saying it directly would force him to explain more than he wanted to. He began paying me the following month. $930 arrived on schedule, with such boring regularity that after a while, I stopped consciously noticing the notification. That was one of the reasons the payment history mattered later. There had been no performance around it, no family meeting, no monthly reminder that I had saved him. Dad simply paid what he had agreed to pay, and I treated it as what it was: a loan between two adults who happened to love each other. Even after he was diagnosed with metastatic cancer the following September, he resisted every attempt I made to make the arrangement softer than the paper said. During one appointment-heavy week, I told him he could pause a payment if treatment expenses were becoming a problem. He was sitting in his living room with a blanket over his legs, irritated at being tired, and even more irritated that I had noticed. "No," he said. "A loan stops being a loan the minute both people start pretending it is something else." I told him that one delayed payment would not turn me into a charity. He gave me a look. "That's not what I'm worried about." I asked what he was worried about. Dad took longer than usual to answer. "You make it very easy for people to tell themselves you don't mind losing something." I rolled my eyes because I thought he was trying to turn a bank transfer into a philosophy lesson. "I'm offering you 1 month, Dad." He shook his head. "And I'm saying no. Let me keep one thing clean." I did. The payment came through 2 days later. After his death, very little felt clean. Lauren and I fought over things neither of us should have cared about as much as we did. She wanted the dining set because Dad had hosted Christmas there. I wanted Mom's handwritten recipes because I was the one who had cooked with her. Lauren wanted to keep the house in the family. I did not. Every object started carrying an argument about who had loved our parents correctly. By January, I was exhausted by ownership itself. I already had my own home. I did not want to become half owner of a property Lauren was emotionally determined to keep, and I did not want months or years of negotiations over whether she should buy me out, how much the house was worth, or whether selling it made me disloyal to Dad. That was why I signed the disclaimer. Nobody put a pen in my hand. Daniel explained the will's language before I signed anything. Dad had left the residuary estate to both daughters, and the will specifically provided that if one of us did not take her share, that share would pass to the other. I knew that disclaiming meant Lauren would ultimately receive the beneficial share I was giving up. I took time to think about it. I also confirmed separately that my creditor claim remained exactly what it had been before: a claim by someone Dad owed money, not a claim by an heir asking for property. I put that confirmation in writing because I did not like important things living only inside conversations. Then I signed. For me, the decision had been simple in a way that probably looked cold from outside. The inheritance was something Dad would have given me. The debt was something he had already agreed to repay. Those were emotionally related because both involved my father, but they were not the same promise. I could choose not to take the first without pretending the second had never existed. Lauren understood enough of that to receive my creditor documents in December. What I had underestimated was how useful my disclaimer would become to her once she started telling people a shorter story. Megan walked away. Sounded cleaner than, "Megan gave me her inheritance, but Dad's estate still owes her money." Clean stories were dangerous when one person got to edit them. I was still thinking about that distinction when my phone vibrated again that Monday evening. This time it was Ryan. We were not close. Before the wedding, our communication had mostly consisted of birthdays, family dinners, and logistical texts about Dad's funeral. His message was careful enough that I could tell he had rewritten it before sending. "I'm trying to understand what happened. Lauren told me you had no financial interest left in the house." I read it twice, then deliberately did not answer for several minutes. Ryan was Lauren's husband. I had no intention of recruiting him into my side of a family fight. Eventually I wrote, "I have no inheritance interest in Dad's estate. I am a creditor of the estate because Dad had a documented loan with me. Those are different facts." Ryan replied almost immediately, "How long has that been part of probate?" I told him my written claim had been formally presented in December, before I signed the disclaimer and months before their wedding. He asked whether Lauren had known. I could have sent him copies. I could have written a paragraph explaining exactly what she had received and when. Instead, I wrote, "Ask her. I'm not going to narrate your wife to you. It was not my job to manage their marriage, and I was not going to become the person Lauren later accused of turning Ryan against her." His answer did not come for nearly an hour. By then I was home, shoes kicked under the kitchen counter, reheating leftovers while Dad's loan folder sat open on my laptop. When Ryan finally replied, the message was longer. He said Lauren had told him the probate issues were essentially administrative, that my disclaimer meant there would be no ownership fight, and that the house would become the foundation for the next stage of their life. He was not accusing her yet. If anything, he sounded like someone checking whether two versions of the same story could somehow both be true. Then he sent one final line that made me stop with my hand on the microwave door. She told me the house was the reason we could finally afford the next phase of her business. I stood there reading those words until the microwave began beeping behind me. Lauren had wanted the house for sentimental reasons. I had always known that. She had talked for months about keeping Dad's place in the family, preserving memories, someday letting children run through the same backyard where we had grown up. But Ryan's message introduced something I had never heard from her. The house was not only a memory. Lauren had already begun spending its future. Ryan's message stayed on my screen longer than it should have. The house was the reason they could afford the next phase of Lauren's business. That was the first time I understood that Lauren had not simply been sentimental when she talked about keeping Dad's place. She had already assigned the property a job. In her version of the future, Dad's house was going to become equity. Equity was going to become financing, and financing was going to become the second chance her first business had not earned. I typed 3 different responses to Ryan and deleted all of them. The easiest would have been to send him the creditor claim, the promissory note, Dad's payment history, and the wedding recording. Then let Lauren explain herself. Part of me wanted to do exactly that. Instead, I wrote, "You should ask Lauren what assumptions she used when the two of you made those plans. I'm not involved in your business or your marriage." Ryan replied that he understood. I did not believe he understood yet, but I was not going to do the understanding for him. By Tuesday morning, the family had started doing what my family always did when an uncomfortable fact appeared. They turned it into a personality problem. My Aunt Denise texted first. She asked whether I was really going after Lauren for Dad's house after giving it to her. Before I could answer, my cousin Erin messaged separately to say she hoped we could settle things privately because Lauren had just gotten married and didn't need this kind of stress. Then the family group chat lit up. Lauren never directly accused me of stealing her inheritance. She did something more effective. She posted a photograph of herself and Dad sitting on the front steps of the house the previous summer, his arm around her shoulders, and wrote that she was grateful to be able to protect the home he trusted me to carry forward. Underneath it came hearts, prayers, comments about Dad smiling down on her, and one message from an older cousin saying, "Some things are worth more than money." I stared at that line while drinking coffee at my kitchen counter, and wondered how quickly people decided money was vulgar when it belonged to someone else. I could have answered with everything. I could have uploaded the note. I could have posted the bank transfers. I could have attached Lauren's toast and let 200 wedding guests hear her say that Dad had left her the house as if probate had already ended. Instead, I typed one sentence into the family chat. I am not claiming an inheritance. Dad's estate owes a documented debt that was formally presented months ago. Denise immediately asked, "But didn't you sign the house over to Lauren?" I answered, "No. I disclaimed my inheritance under Dad's will. Those are not the same thing." That should have been enough for anyone genuinely interested in the truth. It was not enough for people who wanted a simpler story. Someone asked why I was being so legalistic. Someone else said Dad would hate seeing us fight over money. Lauren did not say anything at all. She did not have to. By then, other people were carrying the narrative for her. At work, my friend Claire found me standing in the break room reading another message from Denise. Claire had known me long enough not to ask whether I was fine when my jaw was tight enough to crack a tooth. She asked what Lauren had done now, and I showed her the group chat. Claire scrolled through it, looked at me, and said, "Post the recording." I told her no. She thought I was protecting Lauren. I told her I was protecting myself from turning a probate dispute into internet entertainment. "She humiliated you at her wedding and then lied about you to the whole family," Claire said. "You have proof." I reminded her that the recording proved what Lauren had said, not why she had said it, and that I had no interest in becoming the woman who uploaded her sister's wedding speech because relatives were being annoying. Claire leaned against the counter and studied me. You know there's a difference between being private and letting someone else write your biography, right? I told her I was learning. That question followed me for the rest of the week. I'd always believed silence was a kind of control. If someone wanted a fight I considered pointless, I could leave. If Lauren wanted to argue about who Dad loved more, I could refuse the premise. If relatives wanted gossip, I could deny them material. In most parts of my life, that instinct served me well. I managed operations for a company where half the job was deciding which problem deserved escalation and which one deserved a clean no. But families were not businesses. Silence did not close a file. Sometimes it simply gave the loudest person the last version of events. That Friday, I went to Dad's house for the first time since the wedding. Before Lauren's appointment became disputed, the estate inventory had already identified several boxes of my personal belongings that had remained there after Mom died, and I had written permission to collect them. I carried the email on my phone anyway because I had stopped assuming family permission and legal permission were interchangeable. The brass key felt cold in my hand as I unlocked the side door. I had used that key so many times over the years that my fingers knew the movement without thought. Turn once, lift slightly because the deadbolt stuck in winter, push with my shoulder. The house smelled faintly of dust, lemon cleaner, and the coffee Dad had somehow managed to burn even with an automatic machine. For one disorienting second, I expected to hear him complaining from the kitchen that I had let cold air in. Instead, there was only the refrigerator motor and the soft creak of the floor under my shoes. I went upstairs, found the labeled file box I had come for, and brought it down without opening anything that belonged to the estate. That distinction mattered now. Lauren had already accused me of acting as if the house were still mine, and I had no intention of giving her even a technical reason to say I had searched through Dad's records without permission. On my way back toward the side door, I passed the kitchen table and stopped. The scar on the near corner was still there, a pale crescent where Lauren had dropped a cast-iron pan when she was 19. Dad had refused to sand it out. He said every family needed at least one piece of furniture that admitted people lived there. The key in my hand pulled me backward to another afternoon in that same kitchen, months before Dad ever asked me for $92,000. Lauren had been in trouble again. I did not know then how much trouble, only that one of her business decisions had collapsed into a week of frantic calls. Dad had canceled dinner with me twice because Lauren needed him, then asked if I could drive over on Saturday to help him organize paperwork. I arrived already irritated. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee when I finally said, "Every time you solve something for her, you teach her what happens next." Dad looked at me over the rim of his mug. "What happens next?" he asked, though I knew he understood exactly what I meant. "She calls you again." He set the mug down harder than necessary. "She's my daughter." I remember feeling something in me go very still. "So am I," I said. Dad frowned as if I had made an unfair comparison. "You don't need me the way she does." That sentence had followed me through half my adult life. Sometimes it came disguised as praise. Megan can handle herself. Megan always figures things out. Megan is the one I don't have to worry about. That day I was too tired to pretend it sounded flattering. "You've been saying that since I was 17, I told him. Dad said, "Because it's true." I looked directly at him and said, "No, it's convenient." He did not get angry immediately. That would have been easier. Instead, he looked wounded, which made me angrier because Dad had a way of treating an accurate observation like a betrayal if it arrived without enough softness. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Watch her drown to prove I love you too?" I told him that was not what I had said. "Then what are you saying?" I took the coffee mug away from the papers before he knocked it over and told him, "I'm saying every time Lauren creates a mess, you ask what she needs. Every time I'm tired, angry, overloaded, or disappointed, you tell yourself I'm strong enough to handle it. One of us gets help because she needs it. The other gets responsibility because she can survive it." Dad sat down slowly. The fight seemed to leave his shoulders before it left his face. "When I call you, you answer," he said. I almost laughed because he sounded as though that proved his point. That doesn't make it fair. Dad rubbed one hand over his forehead. For several seconds, he looked older than he had that morning. Then he said something I did not expect. No, it makes it easy. I remember the kitchen becoming very quiet. I had wanted him to argue so I could stay angry. Instead, he admitted enough of the truth to make the anger complicated. Easy for who? I asked. Dad looked down at the table. For me. I sat across from him, but I did not rescue him from the silence. That was another habit I had started breaking by then. Dad eventually said he did not know how to help Lauren without helping too much. I asked why that confusion always ended with someone else carrying the cost. He told me I was being harsh. I told him I was being specific. He smiled without humor and said, "There's my operations director." I told him not to turn the conversation into a joke. He nodded. Fair. Then he looked toward the window and said, "You know what the worst part is? I tell myself I lean on you because I respect you. Sometimes that's even true." I asked, "And the other times?" He answered, "The other times I know you're less likely to fall apart on me." I had not forgiven him after that conversation because there had been nothing simple enough to forgive. Dad did not suddenly stop helping Lauren. I did not suddenly stop answering his calls. Families rarely changed because one person finally found the perfect sentence. But something between us became more honest. He knew I saw the pattern. I knew he saw at least part of it too. That mattered later, especially when I began discovering how much of the pattern he had still kept hidden. The memory released me when my phone buzzed in the present. I was standing beside Dad's kitchen table with the file box under one arm. The message was from Angela Park, the attorney I had retained for myself after Daniel reminded me he represented the estate. She had received a batch of financial records through the formal accounting and document exchange connected to my creditor claim and Lauren's administration. Angela's message was short, nothing conclusive yet. Review the attached HELOC statement when you have time. One draw date may matter. I did not open it inside Dad's house. Maybe that was irrational, but I had spent enough years mixing that building with obligation. I carried my box to the car, locked the door, and slipped the brass key into my purse. I was halfway down the front walk when Lauren's SUV pulled into the driveway. She got out before the engine had fully settled. She was wearing leggings, a long coat, and the expression she used when she had decided anger counted as authority. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. I held up the box. "Collecting my inventoried property. I had permission." Lauren looked at the key in my hand before I put it away. "You gave up the house, Megan. You don't get to walk through it whenever you feel like it." I told her I agreed, which seemed to annoy her more than an argument would have. "I didn't walk through whenever I felt like it. I came for approved property." Lauren crossed her arms. "You always do this." I asked what she meant. "Act like you're above wanting anything." Her voice had changed. This was no longer about permission to enter the house. "You gave away the inheritance because you wanted everyone to know you didn't need it. Now you're still finding a way to take money out of Dad's estate." I felt the old instinct to dismiss her. She was wrong about the debt, and once someone was wrong about the important thing, I often stopped listening to everything else. But there was a small piece of truth buried inside what she had said. I did sometimes make detachment look like virtue. I had signed away an inheritance partly because I genuinely did not want it, and partly because I wanted the conflict to end cleanly. Lauren had spent years watching me walk away from things she would have fought to keep. I could understand how that felt like judgment even when I had not intended it as one. So I did not tell her she was ridiculous. I said, "You're right about one thing. I don't want this house." Lauren blinked, apparently waiting for the insult that did not come. "I don't need Dad's furniture. I don't need half the sale price. I don't need to prove anything by owning the place where we grew up. That's why I signed the disclaimer." She said, "Then stop trying to take it from me." I shook my head. "Not wanting your house is not the same as agreeing you can rewrite my money." Her face hardened. "Dad owed you because you decided he owed you." I almost admired how quickly she could reduce paperwork, payments, and signed agreements to emotion. "Dad decided he owed me," I said. That's why he signed the note and paid it every month. Lauren looked toward the house. He was sick. I told her the loan predated his cancer diagnosis by almost a year. She changed direction immediately. He was under pressure, you know that. I said, yes. Which is why I want to understand where the pressure came from. Something happened in her expression then. It was small enough that I might have missed it if the last week had not trained me to watch her pauses. Her eyes shifted toward the house, then back to me. What is that supposed to mean? She asked. I told her it meant exactly what I had said. Dad had borrowed heavily before he came to me, and I was beginning to look at the timeline. Lauren scoffed. Congratulations, you found another spreadsheet. She walked toward the front door, then turned back. You know what your problem is, Megan? You think numbers make you right. I answered. No, I think numbers make it harder for people to change what happened. I drove home without opening Angela's attachment. I wanted a clear head before I looked at it, because suspicion had its own gravity. Once you wanted two events to connect, every date began looking like a confession. I made dinner, changed clothes, and opened the produced HELOC statement at my desk. Dad's home equity line had existed before the period I cared about, but one draw stood out immediately. It was just under $100,000, taken in the summer of 2023. That was more than a year before Dad asked me for his own loan. It was also far larger than the roof and heating repairs I remembered him mentioning. I opened my old calendar and searched the month. Then I searched my text history with Lauren. Messages began appearing that I had almost forgotten. She had complained about her landlord. She had told me a supplier was threatening collections. She had asked if I could meet for coffee, because she was trying to save the company. A week later, she had sent the message asking whether I would consider lending her money. I had asked for her numbers, looked at them, and told her I would not finance a business that had no workable restructuring plan. Lauren had called me judgmental. Dad had called that evening and said she was terrified. I had told him terror did not change arithmetic. The date of Dad's HELOC draw sat in the middle of those messages. I did not have proof of where the money went. A draw showed borrowing, not destination. Dad might have used it for something else entirely. I reminded myself of that several times because I did not want to become the kind of person who treated coincidence like evidence, merely because it fit a story I had begun to suspect. But I also remembered Dad telling me in 2024 that he had restructured some things around the house. I remembered him becoming vague whenever I asked why the home equity balance had grown so much. I remembered Lauren's face in the driveway when I told her I was looking at the timeline. I emailed Angela one question. Do the produced records include disbursement records or bank statements showing where the large HELOC draw went? She replied that more accounting material had been requested and told me not to infer destination until we had it. That was exactly what I wanted an attorney to tell me. I closed the email and looked again at the statement, then at the dates from Lauren's failed business. Dad had come to me in October of 2024 because the house had become financially unstable. For more than a year, I had assumed that instability came from repairs, taxes, rising costs, and a widower making imperfect decisions with his own money. Now I knew the pressure had started earlier than he had ever admitted to me, and the largest draw I could see had happened the same week my sister's first business shut its doors. Until I saw the date of Dad's largest home equity draw sitting beside the week Lauren's business collapsed, I had treated Angela's involvement as a precaution. I had retained her because Daniel represented the estate and had been careful to remind me that he did not represent me personally. Angela had reviewed my creditor documents, requested records I was entitled to receive in connection with the estate accounting, and kept me from saying anything foolish when I was angry. But I had still been thinking like a daughter, trying to keep a family disagreement contained. The morning after I found that HELOC date, I called Angela and asked for a real meeting. Not a document review. Not a 15-minute phone call. I told her I wanted to understand exactly where I stood before Lauren turned another piece of our father's estate into a family story that had nothing to do with the paperwork. Angela's office was 20 minutes from mine, in a plain building where nobody seemed interested in pretending law was glamorous. She sat across from me with a yellow pad and asked the first question I should have been asking myself all week. What do you want? I started explaining the wedding, but she stopped me gently. Not what Lauren did. Not what your relatives think. What outcome do you want? The answer came faster than I expected. I don't want the house. I don't want my inheritance back. I want the debt treated as a debt. Angela wrote that down. Anything else? I thought about Lauren's ruined toast plan, the family group chat, Ryan's message, and the satisfaction I had felt when Daniel told me the quick distribution path could not move forward. I could have lied and said I wanted nothing else. Instead, I told her, I want her to stop being able to change the meaning of things just because she says them confidently enough. Angela put down her pen. That second goal is emotional. I can help you with the first. I laughed because she was right, and because I appreciated that she had no interest in becoming another person who told me what I wanted to hear. She asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning, but not as a sister. Give me the operations version, she said. Date, document, action, source. If you don't know something, say you don't know it. That was language I understood. I opened my laptop. We started with the summer of 2023. Large HELOC draw from Dad's line of credit. Destination not yet confirmed. I showed her the date and the messages from Lauren around the collapse of her staging business. Angela looked at them and said exactly what she had already told me by email. Timing is not proof of destination. I nodded. Next came October of 2024. Dad asked me for $92,000. Formal unsecured promissory note. Bank transfer from my account to his. Records showing how the loan proceeds were used to stabilize his house-related cash flow, rather than magically erase the mortgage or home equity debt. Then came the recurring payments Dad made to me. $930, month after month. November, December, January. The same amount. Again and again. The timeline became harder when we reached the following year. Dad's cancer diagnosis in September. His death on November 28th. My formal creditor claim presented to Lauren as personal representative on December 15th, with Daniel copied as estate counsel. January, my inheritance disclaimer. March 21st, Lauren's wedding. March 23rd, Daniel's written warning that an unresolved timely creditor claim could not simply vanish from the accounting because I had separately disclaimed a beneficial share under the will. Written like that, it looked cold, efficient, almost impersonal, but every date had a room attached to it in my head. The day Dad signed the note was his kitchen table. His last payment was the soft beep of a bank notification while I sat beside him during an oncology appointment. December 15th was me at my desk 3 weeks after his funeral, uploading documents while still finding his phone number in my recent calls. Angela noticed when I stopped typing. "You okay?" she asked. I told her yes. She waited. I corrected myself. "I'm functional." That made her smile a little. Different answer. I looked back at the spreadsheet. This is what I do when something gets messy. I turn it into dates. Angela said there were worse habits. There are also better ones. I asked whether she billed extra for therapy. Much more than this, she said, and we moved on. When she reached the repayment history, she spent longer on it than I expected. I had always thought the promissory note was the strongest evidence, because it was the formal agreement. Angela explained that the pattern of actual behavior mattered too. Dad had not signed a document and then ignored it. He had treated the obligation like a loan over time. He had made the agreed payments, from his own account, with boring consistency. People can argue about what a document meant, she said. It gets harder when the parties then behave exactly as the document says they will. She tapped the screen where the recurring transfers lined up. This is useful. I looked at one of the last payments and remembered the afternoon Dad had nearly missed it. His cancer treatment had begun to thin him out by then. Not dramatically. Not in the way movies like to make sick people look suddenly fragile. But enough that his clothes hung differently and he needed to sit down more often. I had driven him home after an appointment and found an unpaid utility bill under a stack of mail. He hated when I touched his paperwork without asking, so I held it up and said, "Do you want help with this, or do you want to yell at me first?" Dad answered, "Both." But give me 10 minutes. While we were sorting the mail, I told him he could skip his payment to me that month if treatment costs were tighter than he had expected. He did not even look up. No, I told him I was not asking permission to forgive a late fee. There was no late fee. I was offering breathing room. Dad put down the envelope in his hand, and I said no. I remember getting irritated because he had begun using stubbornness as proof that illness had not changed him. "You're allowed to let me help," I said. He stared at me long enough that I knew we had stopped talking about one bank transfer. "Help is supposed to be chosen every time," he said. I leaned against the kitchen counter. "What does that mean?" "It means you offering and me accepting is help. Me deciding you can afford something, so I don't have to ask anymore, is something else." I looked at him carefully. "Is this about Lauren?" His expression changed just enough to tell me I had gotten near something he did not want to discuss. "It's about me." That wasn't my question. I know. Dad picked up the utility bill again, then put it back down without reading it. "I spent a lot of years thinking your strength gave me permission not to worry about you as much. We've had this conversation." "I know that too. Then why are you saying it now?" He looked tired. Not physically tired this time, older than that. "Because I'm beginning to understand that asking someone to help is one thing. Building your plans around the assumption that they will is another." I asked him again whether he was talking about Lauren. Dad shook his head. "I'm talking about what I did." That frustrated me because he had developed a talent for apologizing around the edges of facts. You know, apologies work better when everyone knows what they're about. "I'm not apologizing. That's convenient." That made him laugh, and then cough, and for a moment I hated myself for having pushed him. He saw it immediately. "Don't do that," he said. "Do what?" "Turn me being sick into a reason you can't be mad at me." I looked down at the envelopes. "You make that difficult." "I know." He reached for his phone. "Now help me find the bank app before I prove I'm still your father by locking myself out of my own account." He made the $930 payment 2 days later. Sitting in Angela's office months after his death, I understood why that memory bothered me. Dad had been trying to tell me something without telling me enough. He knew there was a difference between chosen help and assumed rescue. He knew he had crossed that line somewhere. I still did not know exactly where. Angela brought me back to the present by asking about Lauren's current estate accounting. I told her Daniel had mentioned problems with the way the debt was being handled, but had been careful not to give me advice that belonged to Lauren. Angela said that was appropriate. He represents the estate. His job is not to help you beat your sister. His job is to keep the administration accurate and protect the estate's process. She asked whether I authorized her to communicate with Daniel directly about the creditor claim. I said yes. By that afternoon, the practical problem became clearer. Lauren and the bookkeeper, working from information she had supplied, had circulated an early draft schedule that described Dad's obligation to me as a disputed family advance. That wording alone did not decide anything. Lauren had the right to dispute a claim if she had a legitimate basis. The problem was that the same draft did not reserve the full amount of my claim while she was simultaneously pushing toward a plan that assumed the house could move cleanly into her control. Daniel had already told her in writing that he would not prepare, endorse, or file an accounting in that form. Either the creditor claim had to be resolved through the proper process, or sufficient assets had to remain available while it was disputed. It could not be treated as zero simply because Lauren preferred that number. When Angela read the draft to me, I felt something shift. Up to that point, part of me had still been leaving room for the possibility that Lauren genuinely did not understand the difference between my disclaimer and Dad's debt. It was becoming harder to believe. She had received my claim in December. Daniel had explained the issue. Now she had written warning attached to an accounting process telling her exactly what remained unresolved. Misunderstanding had an expiration date. Lauren was approaching it quickly. Then came the emails about the house. They were not secret. They appeared in estate communications relevant to the proposed handling of the property. And Angela explained where each document had come from before she let me read it. Lauren had already been speaking with a realtor and an appraiser about what she described as the period after I take title. In another thread, She asked how quickly a refinance could be explored once distribution occurred. She was not trying to sell the house. She wanted to keep it, borrow against its equity, renovate it, and use some of the financial room for her next business plan. Ryan's name appeared on a renovation estimate, which matched what he had told me after the wedding. There was no evidence he knew about my creditor claim when those discussions began. One email bothered me more than the others because it had been sent after Daniel's first warning. Lauren asked whether appraisal work could continue, so we don't lose time while Megan's family loan issue gets sorted out. That sentence was not illegal. It was not a confession. It did not prove she intended to steal anything from me, but it told me how she had already arranged the problem in her mind. My documented loan with Dad had become Megan's issue. The house was still her plan. The estate was expected to organize itself around both. I called Daniel with Angela on the line. He sounded exhausted. "I need both of you to understand what I can and cannot do here," he said. "Lauren remains the court, appointed personal representative. I cannot simply stop her from talking to an appraiser or a realtor. I can advise the estate about what documents I can ethically prepare and what accounting I believe can be supported." Angela asked whether he had told Lauren that a final distribution could not reasonably proceed on an accounting that omitted or inadequately reserved a timely creditor claim. Daniel said yes, in writing. He had also told her that if she intended to contest the debt, she needed to do so through the proper estate process, rather than treating the obligation as erased by my disclaimer. I asked, "So when she says you froze the house because I sent you a recording, that's not what happened?" "No," Daniel said. "The recording made me concerned about how she was describing the status of the estate. Your claim was already there. The accounting problem was already there. My letter addressed those things." Angela asked another question. "Has Lauren acknowledged receiving the warning?" "Yes." "Has she withdrawn the draft accounting?" "Not yet." I looked at Angela. She did not react. Daniel continued. "I'm giving her an opportunity to correct it. Probate is not a punishment mechanism, Megan. I need to be careful about language here. I'm not asking you to punish her. I know. I'm reminding everyone, including myself." That was the moment I stopped calling what Lauren was doing a family misunderstanding. A misunderstanding was when two sisters remembered a conversation differently. A misunderstanding was when Lauren thought I had promised her mom's earrings, and I thought I had only agreed to lend them. This was different. Dad's note existed. The payments existed. My formal claim existed. Lauren had received written explanation of the issue, and she was still structuring her plans around the assumption that the estate would eventually bend in the direction she wanted. Angela and I stayed on the call long enough to discuss what information could properly be requested next. No fishing expedition. No demand for every private document Dad had ever touched. Angela wanted the complete accounting relevant to the house and the creditor claim, including records showing the HELOC disbursements, major transfers, estate liabilities, and the basis for Lauren's proposed treatment of my note. Daniel agreed that those categories were relevant to administering the estate, though he would handle production through the appropriate process rather than simply opening every estate file to me. After we hung up, Angela turned her chair slightly toward me. "This is the point where I need authorization." "For what?" "To make the formal request and follow it through. It may increase fees. It will definitely increase tension. Your sister may become more aggressive. Your relatives may decide you've hired a lawyer to take her house." "I already hired a lawyer. You hired me to protect a creditor claim. There's a difference between keeping me on standby and telling me to push for the accounting necessary to test what the personal representative is doing." I looked through the office window at traffic moving below. Part of me still wanted to believe that if I waited another week, Lauren would calm down, correct the accounting, acknowledge Dad's loan, and we could move on without turning every family relationship into evidence. That was my favorite fantasy. Not that everyone would apologize, just that a clean procedural answer would allow me to leave. Then I heard Dad's voice from that afternoon during treatment. Help is supposed to be chosen every time. For years, my family had treated the fact that I could handle a loss as evidence that I should. I had helped Dad because I chose to. I had disclaimed my inheritance because I chose to. Neither decision had given Lauren the right to choose a third sacrifice on my behalf. I looked back at Angela. Do it. She nodded once. But we ask for what we need, I added. No fishing, no threats, no trying to embarrass her. Agreed. If the debt is valid, we enforce it. If something in the records proves I'm wrong about something, you tell me that too. Angela closed the folder. That part is usually implied. Not in my family. For the first time that day, she laughed. The formal request went out. I did not post about it. I did not answer the relatives who kept sending me messages about Dad's legacy. When Denise called to tell me Lauren was devastated that I had lawyered up, I said, I'm not discussing an open estate dispute through the family phone tree. She accused me of sounding like a corporation. I told her that was still better than sounding like a rumor. Several days passed before Angela called. I was leaving work when her name appeared on my dashboard. I answered through the car speakers and expected another question about dates or bank records. Instead, she said, I received the additional accounting material. I pulled into an empty section of the parking garage before continuing. And? There's a payment trail from your father's HELOC. My hand tightened around the steering wheel. Angela paused. I think you were right about the date, she said. But I don't think you're going to like where the money went. Angela did not tell me the destination of Dad's home equity money over the phone. She asked whether I could come to her office the next morning because the records were easier to understand when viewed together, and I knew from her tone that she had already built the same timeline I had. I spent that night trying not to build a story before I had evidence. That was harder than it sounds. Once suspicion has a shape, the brain starts decorating it. Every vague answer Dad had ever given me became suspicious. Every time Lauren had said he helped her through a rough year sounded different. I kept reminding myself that I had hired Angela precisely because I wanted facts before conclusions. By the time I sat across from her the next morning, I had repeated that sentence so many times it no longer felt reassuring. Angela turned her monitor toward me and opened a set of produced bank records that had come through the estate accounting process. I'm going to separate what we know from what we infer, she said. What we know is that your father drew a large amount from the home equity line in the summer of 2023. We now know where most of that money went. She showed me the first transaction. It was a cashier's check to the commercial landlord that had leased Lauren's business space. The second went to an inventory supplier whose name I remembered from the financial statements Lauren had sent me when she asked me for money. Another payment went to a settlement account connected to obligations Lauren had personally guaranteed. There were smaller payments too, and Angela was careful to point out that not every dollar from the home equity line had gone to Lauren. Some covered roof work, heating equipment, and Dad's own household expenses. But the pattern was no longer coincidence. Most of the large draw had been used to keep Lauren's business failure from following her home. I stared at the landlord's name for so long that Angela eventually asked whether I recognized it. I refused to pay that landlord, I said. I opened an old email on my phone and found the spreadsheet Lauren had sent me nearly 3 years earlier. The numbers were still there. Rent arrears, supplier balances, inventory she could not move, personal guarantees. A business that had spent money as if the next month would always be better than the last. I had spent one weekend reviewing everything because she was my sister and because I did not want to say no simply out of irritation. Then I had told her I would not put money into the company unless she closed the oversized location, liquidated inventory, and rebuilt from something smaller. Lauren had said I was asking her to destroy the business in order to save it. I told her the business was already being destroyed by arithmetic. Dad called me that same night. He said Lauren was terrified. I told him I knew. He asked whether there was anything I could do. Yes, I said. I can tell her the truth before she owes even more. He did not like that answer. But he did not tell me what he planned to do instead. Looking at those records in Angela's office, I finally knew. When I refused to fund a rescue I believed would only postpone the failure, Dad had borrowed against his house and funded it anyway. The first emotion I felt was not sympathy for him. It was anger. Clean, hard anger that made me sit back in my chair and fold my arms because I did not trust my hands to stay still. He told me he made bad decisions, I said. Angela waited. When he asked me for money the next year, that was how he described it. He said he'd made some bad decisions around the house. He mentioned repairs. He mentioned cash flow. He never said he had put a huge piece of Lauren's business failure on the house. Angela said nothing, which was exactly the right response. I was not looking for legal analysis in that moment. I was furious at a dead man. Dad had not lied in the narrowest possible sense. There really had been roof work. The heating system really had failed. There really were taxes, insurance, payments, and ordinary expenses. But he had arranged the truth so I could see the pieces least likely to make me ask the question he did not want to answer. He had said, "I made some bad decisions," because that sentence protected Lauren. It also protected him from having to admit that one of the financial problems I was helping him solve had grown out of the exact bailout I had refused to participate in. What hurt most was understanding how my own loan fit into that chain. My $92,000 had not gone directly from my account to Lauren's landlord or supplier. The dates did not support that, and I refused to rewrite them just because it would make the betrayal easier to explain. Dad had used the home equity line for Lauren more than a year before he borrowed from me. By the time he came to me, the house was carrying that old burden alongside repairs, arrears, and other expensive obligations. My money stabilized the later crisis. It paid urgent work, brought house-related accounts current, cleared enough short-term pressure for Dad's pension and Social Security to carry the property again, and kept him from making a rushed sale. I had not paid Lauren's creditors. I had helped Dad continue carrying the consequences after he had. That distinction made the truth more painful, not less. If Dad had come to me in 2023 and said, "I want to borrow money so I can rescue your sister," I would have said no. He knew that because I had already said no to Lauren. A year later, when the cost of his choice had spread into the rest of his finances, he came to me with a different question. Would I help him stabilize his house? I said yes. I did not regret helping him. I regretted that he had let me make the decision without all the information that would have mattered to me. Angela finally asked whether I wanted a break. I shook my head. No, I want to understand all of it. She pointed to the records again and walked me through the dates a second time. She was careful not to tell me what Dad had thought, because bank statements could not do that. They could tell us where money moved. They could tell us when. They could tell us what happened after. The explanation for why Dad had made those choices would have to come from the conversations I had already lived through, and for the first time, one of them returned to me with a meaning I had not understood while he was alive. It had been a few weeks after Dad's cancer diagnosis. I had taken him to an appointment, then stayed at the house while he slept for nearly 2 hours in his chair. When he woke up, I made coffee even though the doctor had told him to cut back. Dad said if cancer was going to take away coffee too, it would have to file paperwork. The joke was so stupid that I laughed harder than it deserved, and for 10 minutes we were not a sick father and the daughter trying to organize his future. We were just the two people who had argued in that kitchen for 20 years. He was watching me rinse the coffee pot when he said, "I used to think being a good father meant giving each kid what she needed." I turned around. "That sounds like the beginning of one of your speeches." "I'm serious. That makes it worse." He smiled, but only for a second. Then he looked down into his cup and said, "I thought if one of you needed more help, I should give more help. Simple. And now I wonder who got to decide what each of you needed." I leaned against the counter. "You did." Dad nodded. "Exactly." At the time, I thought he was finally talking about the emotional pattern between Lauren and me. I thought he meant how often he rushed toward her crises and assumed I would call if mine ever became serious enough. I had no idea there was a financial history underneath the same habit. I asked, "Did you ever think maybe I needed someone to worry about me too?" Dad's face changed. "More than I admitted. That isn't the same as doing it." "I know." I remember being surprised by how quickly he accepted that. Dad could argue with a parking sign if it sounded judgmental. Yet that afternoon he did not defend himself. He rubbed his thumb along the handle of the coffee mug and said, "Sometimes I told myself you didn't need much because I was proud of you. And sometimes," he looked toward the window, sometimes because it made things easier. I had heard a version of that admission before, but illness had stripped some of the defensiveness away. I sat across from him and asked, "Easier how?" Dad gave me a tired smile. "You really don't let people have vague answers, do you? Not when the vague answer is about me." He nodded. "Fair." Then he said, "Lauren scares me sometimes." I frowned. "Lauren? Not like that. I mean the way she handles failure. Every setback feels final to her. Like if one thing goes wrong, everything she is goes with it." I told him that did not mean he should keep preventing consequences. Dad said he knew. I asked whether he did, because knowing and changing were not the same thing. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "I'm beginning to understand that. I wish I could say I had pushed harder. I wish I had asked, 'What did you do?' I wish I had asked whether he had borrowed against the house for Lauren, but I did not know there was a specific fact to uncover. I thought we were having one more complicated conversation about parenting, personality, and all the ways families teach themselves to call a pattern love. I told him, "You know what scares me? You keep treating her fear as an emergency, and my competence as a resource." Dad flinched. I saw it. I remember seeing it. But because I did not know why it landed so hard, I kept talking. "You act like whatever I can survive costs less." Dad looked down at his coffee. "That's not what I want." I didn't say it was. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Intent is a very comfortable chair." "What does that mean?" "It means I've spent too much time sitting in mine." I had laughed softly then, because it sounded like something he had read on a calendar. He told me to stop making fun of a dying man's wisdom. I told him he had been diagnosed 3 weeks earlier and was already exploiting the material. He smiled. The conversation drifted to medication, appointments, and whether Lauren had confirmed Thanksgiving plans. The moment passed. Now, sitting in Angela's office, with the proof of the bailout in front of me, that conversation no longer felt abstract. Dad had known by then exactly what he had done. He had known he had used the house to soften Lauren's fall. He had known the resulting pressure eventually reached me. He had even begun to understand the pattern well enough to describe it. He simply never finished saying the most concrete sentence. "I paid her debts." My anger at him deepened, but it also became harder to keep pure. Dad had not been running some scheme with Lauren to take advantage of me. The records showed a frightened father making a bad decision because one daughter was collapsing in front of him. Then another bad decision. Then another. By the time he understood what the pattern had cost, the consequences were already buried inside mortgage balances, monthly payments, family assumptions, and the silence he had chosen because explaining the truth would force him to admit that his help had become part of the problem. Compassion did not erase what he had done. That was something I had to learn slowly. Understanding why someone makes a choice is not the same as agreeing to absorb its consequences. Dad had loved Lauren. Dad had been afraid of watching her fail. Dad had also let that fear become debt attached to his home, then asked me for help without telling me the whole history. All of those things could be true at the same time. I left Angela's office with copies of the relevant records available to me through the accounting process, and one question I wanted answered by the only living person who could answer it. I did not send Lauren the statements. I did not call Denise. I did not tell Ryan. I drove home, waited until I was calm enough not to shout, and called my sister. Lauren answered on the 4th ring. "If this is about the estate, talk to Daniel." "It's not." A pause. "What do you want?" One answer. "That sounds ominous." "Did Dad use the home equity line to pay your business debts?" The silence on the phone was long enough that I knew she understood the question before she decided how to answer it. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, less aggressive. "He helped me. That wasn't the question. I was losing the company. Did he use the HELOC?" Another pause. "Yes." I closed my eyes. Even though I had already seen the payments, hearing Lauren say it made the betrayal physical in a way bank records had not. "How much did you know?" "What does that even mean?" "You know exactly what it means. Did you know he borrowed against the house to pay the landlord, suppliers, and settlement obligations? Yes, Megan, I knew he borrowed money. And you never thought that was worth mentioning when he came to me a year later? Lauren's voice hardened again. That was between you and Dad. I almost laughed. Exactly. Which is why you don't get to erase it. I'm not erasing anything. You stood in front of a ballroom and told people my signature meant Dad left you the house free and clear. I said you signed your claim away. My inheritance claim. You love that distinction. I love accurate sentences. She exhaled sharply. Fine. Dad owed you money. Congratulations. You were right about the paperwork. Does that make you feel better? No. Then what do you want from me? I want to understand why you've been acting like that debt shouldn't exist. Lauren did not answer immediately. I could hear faint traffic on her end, then the click of a turn signal. She was probably in her car. I asked whether she wanted to call back when she was parked. She said she already was, and I chose to believe her because I had no interest in adding a highway accident to probate. Finally, she said, you had $92,000 to lend him. The sentence stopped me. What? You heard me. You had that kind of money sitting there. I was trying not to lose everything. I felt my anger become colder. Those facts are not connected. They are if you grew up in the same family I did. Explain that. Lauren laughed once, without humor. You always had choices. You had the job. You had savings. You bought your own place. If something went wrong, you made a spreadsheet and fixed it. I had one business fail, and everybody looked at me like that proved who I was. I didn't look at you like that. You refused to help me. I refused to put money into the same plan that was already failing. You wanted me to close it. Yes, because it was losing money. You always make it sound so simple. Some parts were simple. The business could not pay its bills. Dad understood. I stared at the wall across from my desk. Dad was afraid. So fear is not evidence that the bailout was smart. Lauren's voice rose. He was my father. He did what fathers do. And when he couldn't carry it anymore, he borrowed from me without telling me what I was carrying. That was his decision. Yes. So stop blaming me for it. I'm blaming you for what you're doing now. What am I doing now, Megan? Trying to keep Dad's house? The house you didn't want? You're acting like the cost attached to it belongs to everybody except you. Lauren was quiet again. Then she said, you can afford to lose $83,000. There it was. Not a legal argument. Not confusion, not grief. Permission. Permission she had granted herself because of what she believed I could survive. I spoke slowly because I wanted her to hear every word. You keep using what I can afford as proof you're entitled to it. I never asked you for that money. No, Dad made sure you didn't have to. The line landed harder than I expected. Lauren inhaled sharply. You think everything comes back to you. I think this particular debt literally comes back to me. You know what? Fine, take your money, sell the house, do whatever you need to do so you can prove you're the responsible one again. This has nothing to do with being responsible. It has everything to do with it. Her voice was shaking now. Not with sadness exactly. With years of resentment finally getting enough air. Dad trusted you with everything, she said. The numbers, the doctors, the insurance. Every decision. If he didn't understand something, he called Megan. If he had a problem, Megan would know. Megan could fix it. Megan was always the person he listened to. I did not interrupt. Lauren continued. Do you have any idea what it was like to be the other daughter? Yes. No, you don't. I know what it was like to be the daughter everyone assumed didn't need anything. That is not the same. I didn't say it was. She sounded almost angry that I would not compete with her suffering. Then she said, I got one house. That sentence changed the entire argument. Not I inherited the house. Not. Dad wanted me to keep it. I got one house. As if the property were a point scored at the end of a game I had not known we were playing. I sat very still. Lauren, I said, you got my inheritance too. Because you didn't want it. That's right. So why can't you just let me have this? Because Dad's debt to me is not something you get to include in the word this. You already have everything else. I almost asked her what she thought I had. Then I realized the answer did not matter. In Lauren's accounting, my career was something Dad had given me by trusting me. My savings were evidence that I had already won. My competence was an asset she could count against me. The fact that I had voluntarily given up my inheritance did not make her feel fortunate. It confirmed her belief that I had so much that anything I relinquished had never mattered. Suddenly, the house made sense in a way money alone had never explained. Lauren did need the equity. She needed financing. She had business debt and another plan she wanted to build. But if money had been the only motive, she could have talked about selling the house, maximizing the estate, and taking whatever remained. Instead, she had built an entire identity around keeping it. Dad's house was the one physical thing she could point to and say, "He chose me." My loan threatened that story because it revealed the history underneath the property. Dad had once borrowed against that house to protect Lauren from her own business failure. When that choice helped destabilize his finances later, he borrowed from me to keep carrying the house. The home Lauren wanted as proof of being chosen had survived partly because of a chain of decisions involving both daughters, one of which she desperately wanted removed from the story. I asked, "Does Ryan know Dad used the HELOC for your business?" Lauren did not answer. I repeated the question. "He knows Dad helped me." That wasn't what I asked. Her voice became flat. "He doesn't need every humiliating detail from before we were together." "That's between you and Ryan." "Exactly." I almost ended the call there, but then Lauren said, "You think Ryan knows any of this?" I frowned. "Any of what?" "The amount. What Dad actually paid. What it did to the house." She stopped abruptly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. When Lauren came back, her tone had changed. "Forget it. I don't think I will. You're twisting what I said. I haven't said what I think it means." "Then don't." She hung up. I sat alone in my office after the call, looking at Dad's brass key on the edge of my desk. I had taken it out of my purse without realizing it. For years, that key had meant responsibility. Dad fell, I went over. The basement flooded. I opened the door for the repair crew. The furnace failed. I met the technician. After he died, the same key became something heavier, a piece of a house I was tired of being responsible for. Now it meant something else. Dad had spent years trying to prevent Lauren from feeling the full weight of failure. He had told himself she needed more help because she was less able to absorb the fall. He had told himself I needed less because I was stronger. Somewhere along the way, Lauren had learned the same rule from the opposite side. If Megan could survive the cost, then the cost belonged with Megan. That was the rule I was finally refusing. I did not send the bailout records to the family. I did not call Ryan. I did not expose Lauren's failed business in the group chat, even though it would have dismantled the story she had built around Dad's house in less than an hour. Those records belonged inside the estate process, where they mattered. I was angry enough to want Lauren embarrassed, but I was not going to confuse revenge with accuracy. What I could no longer do was pretend the wedding had been one ugly misunderstanding between sisters. Lauren knew Dad's debt to me existed. She knew why Dad had taken on a large part of the home equity burden in the first place. She knew Ryan did not understand the full financial history of the house he was helping her plan around. And in one careless sentence, she had just told me something even more important. Ryan did not know what keeping Lauren afloat had already cost my father. Lauren did not try to deny the bailout after our phone call. She did something more effective. She changed the subject. By Wednesday morning, the question circulating through my family was no longer whether Dad had owed me money. It was what kind of daughter charged interest to her dying father. Aunt Denise called before 8, which was early enough that I knew Lauren had been busy the night before. Denise did not accuse me directly. She preferred concern. "I'm just trying to understand," she said. "Lauren told me Thomas was already sick when you made him sign that loan." I was standing in my kitchen with coffee in one hand and my work bag over my shoulder. For a moment, I felt nothing but disbelief. Then I felt the kind of anger that makes everything around you unusually sharp. "The loan was signed in October of 2024, I said. "Dad was diagnosed with metastatic cancer in September of 2025. Denise went quiet. I continued before she could soften the accusation into another question. "Almost a year later, If Lauren told you otherwise, she gave you the wrong timeline. Denise said she might have misunderstood. I told her that was possible. Then she asked whether I had really charged Dad interest. I said yes, a low rate written into a formal loan he had insisted on documenting, with monthly payments structured around income he could afford at the time. Megan, he was your father. I closed my eyes. I know who he was. Denise sighed as if I were making things unnecessarily difficult. She said most families would never put something like that on paper. I told her most families also did not lend each other $92,000. Then I added something I would not have said a year earlier. Dad did not want this treated like a favor. I'm not going to disrespect him by pretending he was confused about his own agreement, because Lauren needs a better story now. Denise said she was not taking sides. I told her I hoped she would stop carrying messages for the people who were. By lunchtime, 2 more relatives had contacted me. One asked whether I had made Dad sign papers while he was already declining. Another sent a paragraph about how money could destroy families if people let it. I answered exactly one factual point each time. The loan predated Dad's diagnosis. He had made regular payments for nearly a year before becoming seriously ill. I did not send the note. I did not send medical records. I did not send bank statements. I had spent the first half of my adult life learning that once you began defending yourself to a family audience, the burden never stopped moving. Prove the date and someone asked about the interest rate. Prove the interest rate was modest and someone asked why I needed repayment at all. Prove Dad insisted on repaying me and someone would ask whether a good daughter should have accepted. There was no amount of documentation capable of satisfying a person whose real position was that my money mattered less because I had more of it. Claire caught me deleting another message at work and asked whether Lauren had started a press campaign. More like a family podcast, I said. Same episode, different caller. Claire wanted to know why I did not simply send everyone the loan date and the cancer diagnosis date together. I told her I had corrected the timeline. Anything beyond that would turn Dad's private finances and illness into ammunition. You know she's counting on that, right? Claire asked. I looked at her. Counting on what? She set her coffee down. That you have standards she doesn't have. I hated how accurate that sounded. Lauren knew I would not upload Dad's records to win a group chat. She knew I would not humiliate him posthumously to defend myself. She knew I disliked emotional spectacle enough that I might let people believe something ugly about me rather than turn our father's last years into evidence for public consumption. What I had always considered restraint was becoming one more resource she expected me to provide. That afternoon, Ryan texted and asked if I would meet him for coffee. I stared at the message for several minutes before answering. I did not want to become the person who sat across from my sister's husband and built a case against her marriage. But after what Lauren had said about what Ryan did not know, ignoring him felt like another form of participation. I agreed on one condition. I'll answer questions that concern my money, Dad's estate, or facts I can verify. I'm not going to tell you what to think about Lauren. Ryan replied. Fair. We met the next evening at a coffee shop halfway between our offices. He arrived before me and had chosen a table near the back, away from the line. He looked different without wedding clothes and family noise around him. Less like the groom from a photograph, and more like a man who had not slept enough in several days. He ordered black coffee. I ordered tea because I had already had enough caffeine to become legally unreasonable. For the first minute, neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, Ryan said, I'm not here to get you to attack your sister. I told him that was good, because I had no intention of doing it. He rubbed one hand across his jaw. I need to know whether I made financial decisions based on things that weren't true. That was a question I could answer without entering their marriage. Tell me what you were told. Ryan said Lauren had explained that Dad's house carried a first mortgage and a home equity balance, mostly because of repairs and the costs of maintaining an older property. He knew the house was not debt-free. He had never believed they were inheriting $500,000 in cash. But Lauren had described the remaining equity as substantial enough that once probate cleared and title passed to her, they could refinance under reasonable terms, renovate selectively, and still use some financial capacity to restart her business on a smaller scale. She said you waived everything, Ryan added. Not just the house. Everything. I waived my inheritance. I know that now. I took a sip of tea. My creditor claim was filed before the disclaimer. Dad's loan and my inheritance were separate. Ryan nodded. He had heard that from me already. This time, he seemed to be trying to understand the sequence rather than the conclusion. Lauren told me Dad borrowed against the house because of the roof, furnace, taxes, stuff like that. Some of that is true. Some? The estate records show a large HELOC draw in 2023 went mostly to obligations connected to Lauren's first business. He stared at me. I did not fill the silence. Eventually he said, "How much? I'm not going to give you every number from estate records unless it becomes appropriate through the process." His mouth tightened, but he nodded. Did she know? Yes. You're sure? I asked her directly. She admitted Dad used the line to help her. Ryan looked down at his coffee. She told me he gave her some money after the business failed. She never said he borrowed against the house to do it. That is something you need to discuss with her. I have. I waited. Ryan gave a humorless laugh. That's why I'm here. He pulled out his phone and said he wanted to show me something. I told him he did not have to share private conversations with me. They're my conversations too, he said. I'm choosing to. That distinction mattered, so I let him turn the phone toward me. The first messages were from months before the wedding. Lauren had been discussing renovation plans, possible refinancing, and a smaller relaunch of her staging business. None of that was inherently suspicious. People made future plans based on inheritances all the time. What mattered was how certain she sounded. Once probate clears, the house is mine. In another message, Megan waived everything so there won't be a buyout fight. Ryan had asked whether any estate debt could complicate things. Lauren replied that there were ordinary expenses, but nothing that should materially interfere. Then he scrolled farther back. A message from Lauren appeared from January, shortly after I signed the disclaimer. Ryan had asked whether my creditor paperwork affected the property. Lauren replied, Dad still has that note with Megan in the estate file, but it's basically family paperwork. She's not actually going to collect against me. I read it twice. Ryan watched my face. She knew. Yes. She told me you weren't going to collect. I never told her that. Did you ever suggest it? No. He leaned back in his chair. Then why would she say it? I could have answered with everything I had begun to understand about Lauren. She believed I had already won. She believed my savings made my loss less real. She believed Dad's house was the one thing she had finally been chosen to receive. But those were interpretations, not facts Ryan had asked me for. You should ask her, I said. Ryan's frustration showed. You keep saying that. Because she's your wife. And you're her sister. Which is exactly why I'm not going to tell you how to interpret her. He stared at me for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. Okay, fact question. Did Lauren know before the wedding that your debt was still in the estate? Yes. Did the estate attorney tell her? Yes. She received the claim in December. Daniel also addressed it after the wedding when the accounting and distribution plan became an issue. Ryan looked again at the message. So, the toast wasn't just her being sloppy with words. I thought about the ballroom, the red wine, wait until she's gone. The applause when Lauren announced that Dad had left her the house and I had signed away my claim. No, I said. I don't think it was. That was as far as I was willing to go. Ryan stayed quiet for a while, then asked a question I did not expect. Why did you sign the disclaimer? Because I didn't want the inheritance. That part I understand. Why did you do it knowing Lauren was like this? The question irritated me enough that I almost ended the conversation. Like what? Someone who takes the cleanest version of a situation and makes it hers. I looked at him more carefully. That sounds like something you've learned recently. It is. I wrapped both hands around the teacup. The easy answer was that I had not anticipated this specific fight. The more honest answer was harder. I thought giving up ownership would remove me from the conflict. Ryan did not say anything. I didn't want half the house, I continued. I didn't want a buyout negotiation. I didn't want arguments over whether she could afford it, whether we should sell, whether keeping Dad's home meant loving him more. I thought if I removed my beneficial share, there would be nothing left for us to fight over. Ryan asked, "Did it work?" I almost laughed. No. What did it do? The question sat between us. I thought about Lauren's toast and the empty chair where I had been supposed to sit while she announced my decision for me. It left her alone with the story, I said. Saying it out loud hurt more than I expected. I had spent years believing I was good at walking away. Sometimes I was. I had walked away from bad arguments, bad investments, people who treated chaos like intimacy. But there was another version of walking away I had never named. Sometimes I left because I did not want to remain in a situation long enough to be misunderstood. I thought a clean exit protected me. In reality, it sometimes meant other people were free to explain my absence however they wanted. Ryan said, "That doesn't make what she did your fault." I know. You sound like you're blaming yourself. I'm evaluating myself. Different thing. He smiled faintly. Operations director. Unfortunately, we sat there another half hour. I did not tell him what to do about Lauren. He did not ask whether I thought he should leave her. He told me one thing I had not known. He had agreed to delay a larger purchase for his own career plans because Lauren believed the house would soon give them financial flexibility. Nothing catastrophic. He had not invested his retirement account or signed a dangerous loan, but he had planned around a future Lauren presented as much more certain than it was. That mattered because her deception was no longer limited to a wedding audience. It had entered their household decisions months earlier. Before we left, Ryan said, "If I ask you for copies of anything, I assume you'll tell me to go through the proper process." Yes, thought so. But you have your own messages. Those are yours. He nodded. I hesitated before standing. Ryan, one thing. What? I'm not trying to break your marriage. I know. No, you need to actually hear me. Whatever you decide about Lauren belongs to you. Don't make me the reason. Ryan looked tired again. I don't think you're the reason. I left before either of us said something bigger. The following morning, Angela forwarded me a piece of estate correspondence that mattered for a different reason. It was not secret and it was not new. It had been part of the administration record after I presented my creditor claim. Daniel had written Lauren explaining that my disclaimer of inheritance did not by itself extinguish the separate debt claimed under Dad's promissory note. Lauren's reply was short. She called the obligation a family advance Megan is unlikely to enforce, and asked whether the estate could move ahead assuming I would eventually waive it. Daniel's answer was even shorter. No assumption could replace a written resolution of the claim. I read the exchange twice. That was the point where I stopped giving Lauren even the benefit of sloppy understanding. She had known before the wedding. She had been told in writing. She had chosen to believe my reluctance to fight was more reliable than the documents in front of her. The fatal mistake was not that she misunderstood me. She understood me too well, or she understood the version of me our family had depended on for years, the daughter who could absorb a loss, the sister who would decide peace cost less than conflict, the woman who could afford to leave money on the table, and therefore probably would. Lauren's plan required me to remain predictable. I no longer was. She discovered that the next evening when she called, I was home, sorting laundry, when my phone lit up. I almost ignored it, but I had stopped confusing avoidance with peace. Hi, Lauren. You met Ryan. Not a question. Yes. Her breathing changed. What did you tell him? The truth about the loan and the estate. He showed me messages he chose to show me. I told him to discuss your marriage with you. You had no right to answer questions about my own money, to poison him against me. I didn't. You told him about the HELOC. He asked why Dad's balance was so high. I told him estate records show some of the borrowing went to your old business. That was none of his business. You built your new business plan around that same house. So now you're judging my marriage too? No. You think you can say no in that cold little voice and suddenly it becomes true? The accusation was almost funny coming from her. I said, Lauren, if you have a problem with what Ryan knows, talk to Ryan. I am talking to you. Yes. About Ryan. She made an angry sound. You always do this. You hide behind distinctions. Facts have distinctions. Dad's not a fact to me. Neither is he to me. Then stop treating his estate like a contract dispute. There is literally a contract in dispute. Lauren's voice sharpened. You know what I think? I think you like this. Like what? Being the one with paperwork. Being the one who knows the rules. Making everyone else come to you for the answer. I started to respond, then stopped. There was enough truth in the accusation to deserve examination, even if Lauren was using it badly. I did like competence. I liked being the person who knew what needed to happen next. Sometimes I let that become arrogance. Sometimes I assumed people who did not plan the way I planned were simply irresponsible rather than different. My refusal to fund Lauren's first business had been correct, but I had not always delivered correct answers with kindness. I could admit that without surrendering the money Dad owed me. I can be controlling, I said. Lauren went silent. I can be impatient. I can make a decision and act like everyone else should reach it at the same speed. I know that about myself. She clearly had not expected the admission. Then I continued. None of that changes the note. Her laugh came out bitter. There it is. What? The paperwork. Always the paperwork. Dad made the paperwork. Because you made him feel like he had to. The sentence hit harder than anything else she had said. I stood still beside the laundry basket. Lauren heard my silence and pressed forward. You think I didn't see it? Every time he needed something from you, you made him prove he wasn't taking advantage. You asked for statements. You asked for numbers. You made your own father sign a loan because God forbid anyone think Megan Walker gave something without terms. That is not what happened. Isn't it? No. He was embarrassed about money. You know he was. Yes. And you still made it formal. He made it formal. Because you made him feel like a burden. My stomach tightened. That was the first accusation Lauren had made that reached past anger and found fear. I remembered Dad sitting at the kitchen table with the loan packet already prepared before I arrived. I remembered him saying he did not want his daughter saving him. I remembered asking questions like a lender, because $92,000 was not grocery money. I remembered how proud he had been when he made each payment. But grief had a talent for opening doors you believed were locked. For one ugly moment, I wondered whether I had misunderstood all of it. Whether Dad had documented the loan not because it gave him dignity, but because I had made generosity feel unsafe around me. Lauren heard that moment in my silence. Exactly, she said. My anger returned, but it was no longer clean. You don't get to use Dad to tell me what Dad thought. I knew him too. I know. He wanted me to keep the house. He may have wanted that. He would never want you forcing a sale over money you don't need. That's where you keep losing me. You don't get to decide what I need. You're hiding behind paperwork because you know I'm right. No, I'm relying on paperwork because dead people cannot answer phone calls. Lauren went quiet. Then she said, He would hate this. I looked at Dad's key on the small table beside my front door. Maybe he would, I said. That doesn't mean you get to speak for him. She hung up. I stayed where I was for several minutes after the call ended. Lauren had found the one attack I could not dismiss with a date or a bank record. Had I made Dad feel like a burden? Had my insistence on boundaries become its own form of distance? There were conversations I could replay both ways. Times I had been too efficient when he needed patience. Times I had answered emotional questions with financial ones because numbers were safer. I had flaws, serious ones. The fact that Lauren was weaponizing them did not make them imaginary. But neither did my flaws make her right. I called Angela. She answered from what sounded like her car. I told her what Lauren had said. Angela listened without interrupting, then asked, Are you asking me whether you were a good daughter? No, good, because my hourly rate does not cover that. Despite myself, I laughed. I'm asking whether there's anything in the loan file that suggests Dad signed under pressure from me. Anything I'm forgetting. Angela was quiet for a moment. I reviewed the executed packet again this afternoon, and the note itself is clean. The transfer matches. The payment history matches. There is no indication in the transaction record that you coerced him. That's legal language. You called a lawyer. Fair. She hesitated. There is something else. My body went still. What? The original packet you received in 2024 includes a cover acknowledgement from your father. You had a copy from the beginning. I think you treated it as boilerplate, because at the time you had no reason to read anything else into it. I remembered the folder on Dad's kitchen table. Pages I had reviewed for payment dates, signatures, interest calculations, terms. What does it say? I'd rather you read the sentence yourself. Angela, I'm sending you the page now. My email notification sounded while she was still speaking. I opened the attachment. Dad's signature sat near the bottom of the page. Above it was a sentence I had possessed for almost a year and a half, without understanding why he had chosen those exact words. Angela's voice came through the phone. There's one sentence in that loan packet you signed around, Megan. You had it the whole time. I don't think you knew what it meant yet. The page Angela sent me was not a secret letter, a hidden confession, or some miraculous document that had appeared after Dad died. I had received it in October of 2024 with the original loan packet. My signature sat on the next page. Dad's was at the bottom of this one. I had read it when we executed the loan, but back then I had been checking dates, payment terms, and whether the numbers matched what we had discussed. One sentence had registered as nothing more than Dad trying to preserve his dignity. Now, after seeing the home equity money that had gone into rescuing Lauren's business, I read it again. This is a real loan. I don't want Megan's help turning into another family bailout. I stared at the words until they stopped looking like ink and started feeling like a conversation Dad had been trying to finish for more than a year. Angela stayed on the phone while I read it a second time. She reminded me that the acknowledgement was part of the executed transaction record I had received when the loan was made. It was not privileged correspondence pulled from Daniel's private attorney file. It was not something Dad had written for me to find after his death. He had signed it while he was alive, in the same packet I already possessed. Daniel later confirmed only the boring facts that mattered. The document was authentic, it was created with the loan, and Dad had approved the language. He refused to speculate about what Dad had meant by another family bailout. He did not need to. I knew what the phrase meant now, because I had seen the HELOC trail. The sentence did not prove Lauren owed me anything. The promissory note and Dad's payment history already did that. What it changed was my understanding of him. For months, I had been angry because Dad never told me directly that he had borrowed against his house to rescue Lauren's business. That anger did not disappear, but the acknowledgement showed that by the time he came to me, he understood at least part of what he had done. He knew he had turned one daughter's crisis into a family financial burden. He knew asking me for help risked continuing the same pattern. That was why the loan had arrived at his kitchen table already drafted. It was why he insisted on a payment schedule I had initially considered almost too formal between a father and daughter. Dad had not suddenly become perfect at boundaries. He had simply realized late that if he did not put one on paper, love would blur it again. I remembered another afternoon during his treatment, one I had already revisited more than once since his death. I had offered to let him pause one of the $930 monthly payments. Dad had refused so quickly that I thought he was being stubborn for sport. That day, though, he had said something slightly different from the line I remembered most. We were sitting in his living room, and he was tired enough that his eyes kept closing between sentences. I told him skipping 1 month would not change anything. He opened his eyes and said, "If I stop paying because you love me, I turn you back into the daughter who fixes things." I told him that was dramatic. Dad shook his head. "No, it's specific." Then he added, "You offered this time. I'm saying no." That's what a boundary is supposed to look like. I had teased him for becoming philosophical after oncology appointments. Now I saw the sentence differently. He had not been afraid I would turn the loan into a gift. He had been afraid he would. That did not absolve him for what he had hidden. If anything, it made the hiding more complicated. Dad knew the pattern was wrong, while still lacking the courage to tell me the full truth about how it had started. He had tried to repair one part of the damage through paperwork, because he could not bring himself to repair all of it through confession. I loved him enough to understand that. I was angry enough not to romanticize it. The settlement proposal arrived 3 days later through Angela. Lauren had hired separate counsel by then, which was the first sensible decision she had made since the wedding. Her proposal was dressed in words like compromise, family preservation, and practical resolution. The numbers underneath were simpler. Lauren would formally acknowledge a reduced portion of Dad's debt. I would forgive $40,000. The remaining balance would be handled through the estate, and the reduced liability would make it easier for her to pursue a refinance and keep the house. In exchange, she would stop disputing that the note was a genuine loan. The proposal did not ask me to withdraw my creditor claim entirely. That made it more dangerous, because it was reasonable enough to tempt me. Aunt Denise called before I had even finished reading the email. I did not need to ask how she knew. Lauren's definition of settlement confidentiality had apparently always included family lobbying. Denise said, $40,000 was a small price to keep Dad's house in the family. I asked whether she would like to contribute it. She told me not to be sarcastic. Megan, you know what I mean. You make good money. You have your own house. Lauren is trying to rebuild her life. I looked at the spreadsheet on my laptop, where I had already calculated exactly what accepting the proposal would cost me. Why does what I need determine what Lauren owes? I asked. Denise said families were not businesses. I told her, then Lauren should stop treating my bank account like family inventory. After I hung up, I did something that surprised me. I seriously considered saying yes. $40,000 would not destroy me. It would hurt. It would postpone a few things I wanted to do. It would reduce the cushion I had worked years to rebuild after making Dad's loan. But I could survive it. I could absorb it without touching retirement, without losing my house, without changing my life dramatically. More importantly, accepting would end the ugliest part of the fight. Lauren could stop telling relatives I wanted to sell Dad's home. The creditor dispute would shrink. Daniel could move the estate forward more easily. Ryan and Lauren would have whatever conversations they needed without my money sitting between them. I could go back to work, my own house, my own life, and stop waking up every morning wondering what version of me had been distributed overnight. That was exactly why the offer was dangerous. I sent Angela my calculation and told her I was considering it. She did not tell me I was making a mistake. She did not tell me Dad would want me to stand firm. She asked one question. Would you choose this if nobody were angry with you? I knew the answer before she finished speaking. No. Why not? Because I don't believe I owe Lauren $40,000. Angela waited. I stared at Dad's acknowledgement on the other side of my screen. If Lauren had come to me before the wedding and said, I can't keep the house if the estate pays your claim in full, would you consider reducing it because this place matters to me? I might have listened. I don't know what I would have decided. But that isn't what happened. She decided I wouldn't collect. Then she told Ryan I wouldn't collect. Then she told the family my disclaimer meant the debt was gone. Then she tried to structure the estate around the assumption that I would eventually be too tired or embarrassed to disagree. Angela said, So this isn't about whether you can afford the discount. No, that's the trap. For years, the fact that I could survive a loss had been used to make the loss seem smaller. Dad had done it emotionally, long before he ever did it financially. Lauren had learned the same arithmetic. Megan can handle it. Megan has enough. Megan does not need the house. Megan does not need the money. Each sentence sounded almost compassionate until you noticed that every calculation ended with me giving something up. I called Dad's house phone in my memory then, though I knew nobody would answer. I thought about the last year of his life, the way he had tried to make one thing clean after years of blurring everything else. He had not asked me to forgive the loan. Even when he was sick, even when I offered relief, he kept paying. Whatever else he had failed to tell me, he had been explicit about that. The next morning, Angela sent Lauren's attorney my response. I would not forgive $40,000. I would cooperate with any reasonable administration that paid the valid debt through available estate funds, sale proceeds, or a properly funded refinance. I was not demanding the house be sold. I was not asking for my inheritance back. I was not asking for interest beyond the agreement or punitive fees. I was simply refusing to convert Dad's debt into another gift to Lauren. Lauren called me herself that night. You rejected it. Yes. You didn't even counter. I did. I said I'll accept proper payment through the estate. That's not a compromise. It is from my side. I'm not asking for anything beyond what Dad agreed to. You know I can't keep the house if you insist on every dollar. I know keeping the house gets harder. Same thing. No, it isn't. She made an impatient sound. You always do that. What? Correct words instead of hearing people. The accusation was not entirely false, which made it worth answering carefully. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I use precision because feelings are harder. But right now the words matter. You're saying I'm making you lose the house. I'm saying the house has debts and obligations attached to it, and you want me to erase one so your plan works. It was Dad's home. I know. He wanted it kept in the family. Then he also made a real loan and paid it every month. You don't know what he wanted at the end. I thought about the acknowledgement. I know what he signed. You always have a document. This time Dad made sure I did. That silenced her for a moment. I continued. I already gave up my inheritance, Lauren. I am not also converting Dad's loan into your gift. She said I was making everything sound transactional. I told her she was the one asking me to transfer $40,000 of value to her, without calling it that. You think because you can put a number on something, you understand it, she said. No, I answered. I think putting a number on it stops us from pretending the sacrifice is free. Lauren's voice softened then, which somehow made me more cautious. What if I say I'm sorry? For what? She hesitated. That told me enough. I said, I'm not selling an apology for $40,000. She hung up without another word. For 2 days, nothing happened. I almost believed separate counsel had convinced Lauren to slow down. Daniel continued working through the administration. Angela told me patience was now more useful than confrontation. I went to work, ignored the family chat, and stopped checking my email every 20 minutes. Then Daniel copied Angela on a new accounting issue. Lauren had instructed the bookkeeper to keep my claim outside the full reserve in the next proposed schedule. Her explanation was that the amount remained disputed and that a family resolution was still expected. That alone might have been correctable. The problem was that Lauren had already received my written rejection of the settlement and Daniel's instruction that the timely claim either needed to be properly resolved or fully accounted for, while disputed. There was no longer any reasonable basis to treat my future forgiveness as an assumption. At the same time, Lauren continued estate communications about appraisal, title timing, and potential refinance, as if house distribution remained the expected outcome. Again, none of those conversations by themselves were crimes. Personal representatives were allowed to gather information. Beneficiaries were allowed to explore whether they could retain property. But Lauren was no longer simply gathering information. She was trying to administer the numbers according to the result she personally needed. Daniel's response was blunt. He wrote that he could not endorse or submit an accounting that failed to accurately address the full unresolved creditor claim. He asked Lauren to correct the reserve. Her attorney advised cooperation. Lauren initially refused. When Angela told me, I felt less satisfaction than I expected. Mostly I felt tired. Lauren had been offered off-ramps at every stage. She could have acknowledged the loan in December. She could have explained it honestly to Ryan. She could have corrected the toast narrative. She could have fixed the draft accounting after Daniel's first warning. She could have accepted my refusal of the settlement and let the estate process work. Instead, every time reality narrowed her options, she tried to narrow reality. Angela and I reviewed the communications the following afternoon. She separated them into 2 piles. The first contained family ugliness, the wedding toast, relatives' messages, Lauren saying I did not need the money. None of this is why a court takes control away from a personal representative, she said. The second pile contained administrative conduct, formal notice of my timely creditor claim, Daniel's warnings, Lauren's instructions about the reserve, her continued treatment of distribution and refinance as effectively settled, and her resistance to correcting the accounting after being told the problem explicitly. This is the pile that matters, Angela said. I looked at it. Is it enough? Enough for what? To remove her? Angela shook her head slightly. That's not how I want you thinking about it. Removal is not revenge. We would ask for accurate administration first. If her personal interest keeps impairing that, resignation or removal becomes a remedy. I nodded. So we're not there yet. We're close enough that she needs to understand what happens if she keeps pushing. I sat back in my chair. I don't want the court fight. I know. I don't want to spend months proving my sister is difficult. That wouldn't be the issue. I know that too. Angela closed the folder. Megan, this is the same choice you just made with the settlement. You keep trying to find the version that ends cleanly. That's because clean endings are underrated. Sometimes. I looked at her. She continued. But if Lauren will only accept an ending where you absorb the unresolved part, clean is not the same as fair. I hated when lawyers accidentally became useful philosophers. Angela slid the second pile back toward herself. We give her one more formal opportunity to correct the accounting and administer the estate without treating her preferred house outcome as predetermined. And if she doesn't? Angela's expression did not change. If Lauren keeps administering the estate as though her personal outcome comes first, this stops being a sister fight. We ask the court to take the estate out of her hands. The next morning, I found Dad's brass key under a stack of papers on my desk while I was preparing the timeline Angela would use if we had to challenge Lauren's administration. I had been sorting dates, emails, repayment records, and Daniel's written warnings into a sequence that could be understood by someone who did not know our family. The key must have slipped out of my purse days earlier. I picked it up and rolled it between my fingers, feeling the worn teeth and the smooth brass head Dad had marked years ago with a shallow scratch so he could tell it from the garage key. For a few seconds, the legal documents in front of me disappeared. I was back in his living room in November, less than 3 weeks before he died, listening to him say the last thing I had not understood until now. It had not been a dramatic deathbed scene. Dad was sick, but he was still lucid, still annoyed when people spoke too slowly around him, still capable of making me regret asking whether he needed help standing up. I had brought groceries and stayed longer than I intended because he was having a decent afternoon. We ate soup at the small table near the window instead of the kitchen, because he said he was tired of staring at the same 4 walls. Lauren had been there earlier, but by the time I arrived, she had already left. Dad asked whether she had called me. I said no. He nodded as if that confirmed something he had expected. After we finished eating, I gathered the bowls and told him I would come back the next morning. Dad said, "When I'm gone, don't make decisions because you're tired." I looked over my shoulder. That sounds suspiciously specific. He shifted in his chair. It is. Do I get context? You know exactly what I mean. No, I don't. Dad gave me a look that would have been more effective if he had not been wrapped in a blanket. You do this thing. That narrows it down. You decide something isn't worth wanting so nobody can use it to hurt you. I stopped gathering dishes. Or maybe I know when to walk away. Sometimes. The answer irritated me because he said it calmly instead of arguing. And the other times? The other times you decide being done is easier than admitting something mattered. I sat back down across from him. You're giving me emotional advice now? That should scare both of us. I smiled despite myself. Then I asked what he was really talking about. Dad looked toward the hallway, where family photographs still hung in the same order Mom had arranged them years earlier. You and Lauren, he said. That is not a subject you need to fix right now. I'm not fixing it. You've been trying for 30 years. I'm beginning to suspect I wasn't very good at it. I did not rescue him from that admission. By then, we had reached a place where love did not require me to make every uncomfortable sentence easier for him. Dad continued. You know what I worry about with Lauren. She panics when she thinks she's losing something. She starts trying to control the outcome before she understands the problem. That sounds familiar. I know. And what do you worry about with me? He looked directly at me. That you leave too early, I laughed softly. Dad, if this is about me refusing to be Lauren's emergency fund, it isn't. Then what? You're good at making an exit look principled. The line irritated me enough that I almost stood up. Sometimes the exit is principled. Yes. Sometimes walking away is the healthy choice. Yes. Then why are you making it sound like a character defect? I'm not. He paused to catch his breath, then continued. I'm saying make sure you're walking away because you're done. Not because everybody else made staying expensive. I remember looking at him for several seconds without answering. At the time, I thought he was warning me not to let Lauren drive me out of the family after he died. I told him he was worrying about arguments that had not happened yet. Dad gave me a tired smile. I've met my daughters, I asked. What if I genuinely don't want whatever we're fighting about? Then let it go. That sounds like exactly what I said. No, you said walk away. I said no, why? I hated when he managed to make a distinction before I did. He reached for the glass of water on the table, then added, There's a difference between deciding something has no value to you and deciding the price of defending it is too high. I told him he was overthinking things. Dad said, You learned that from me. That afternoon had ended with ordinary things. Medication. A complaint about hospital food. A discussion about whether the thermostat was too high. I hugged him before I left and told him I would see him the next morning. I did. Nothing about the conversation felt like a final message at the time. Dad did not know exactly when he would die, and neither did I. That was what made remembering it harder. It was not a speech designed for my future. It was simply one more imperfect conversation between us, spoken by a man who had finally begun recognizing patterns he should have seen years earlier. 2 months after his death, I had signed the inheritance disclaimer because I believed I was done. I did not want Dad's house. I did not want a beneficial share that would keep Lauren and me tied together through appraisals, buyout negotiations, and arguments about memory. I still believed that choice had been right. What I had failed to notice was how quickly exhaustion had become part of the decision. I had wanted peace so badly that I had treated my own withdrawal as the easiest way to buy it. Now Lauren was asking me to do the same thing again. Only this time she wanted me to walk away from a debt Dad had explicitly refused to turn into a gift. I set the brass key beside my laptop and called Angela. She had already begun drafting what she called a narrow objection. That word mattered. We were not accusing Lauren of stealing from the estate. We were not alleging forgery, fraud, or criminal conduct. We were not asking a judge to punish her because she humiliated me at her wedding. Angela based everything on the administration itself. My creditor claim had been timely presented. The promissory note and repayment pattern supported it. Lauren had received written notice that the claim could not simply be treated as extinguished by my inheritance disclaimer. The proposed accounting still failed to reserve the full disputed amount accurately, and after repeated warnings, Lauren continued pushing a house distribution plan structured around the outcome she personally wanted. Angela read the requested relief aloud. We would first ask for a corrected accounting and proper treatment of the unresolved claim. If Lauren continued refusing to administer the estate accurately because her personal interest in retaining the house conflicted with her fiduciary responsibilities, we would ask for a neutral successor. I want one thing removed, I said. Angela looked up. What? Anything suggesting I want my inheritance restored. It doesn't. Good. You've been very clear. I want it clear enough. Nobody can pretend otherwise. She nodded and made a note. I added, and I don't want personal damages because she poured wine on me, embarrassed me, called relatives, or lied to Ryan. None of that belongs in this filing. I know. I'm saying it because I need to hear myself say it. Angela leaned back. You're afraid this is becoming revenge. Part of me wants her humiliated. That's human. It's also not what probate is for. No. I looked at the draft again. Then keep me inside the lines. That's one reason you hired me. The evidence packet was unpleasant precisely because none of it was dramatic. There was no secret recording where Lauren admitted she planned to steal the house. There was no forged deed or fake signature. There were emails, instructions, draft accounting schedules, written warnings. The kind of documents people rarely notice until a pattern gives them meaning. One email from Lauren to the bookkeeper came after Daniel had explicitly told her the full creditor claim had to be accurately reflected or reserved unless formally resolved. Lauren instructed the bookkeeper to continue listing it as a family advance and wrote that I was unlikely to actually pursue collection once the family settlement is finalized. Another message asked whether the house could still be valued and refinance options explored while Megan's issue was being handled separately. Daniel replied that information gathering was fine, but no distribution package could be prepared on the assumption that my claim would disappear. Lauren acknowledged the warning. 3 days later, she repeated essentially the same instruction. That was the part Angela circled. She was told, she said. Yes. And she continued. Yes. This is why we are not relying on motive. We don't need to prove what she was thinking. We show what she knew and what she did after she knew it. That distinction made the whole thing feel cleaner. Lauren could tell herself she was preserving Dad's house. She could tell relatives she was protecting his legacy. She could tell Ryan she believed I would eventually forgive the debt. None of those beliefs gave her permission to make an inaccurate estate accounting true through repetition. Daniel provided his own written record of the warnings he had given in his role as estate counsel. He did not join my side. He did not write that Lauren was dishonest. He documented that he had advised her of the unresolved claim, told her he could not endorse or submit an accounting that failed to reflect it properly, and recommended that she either resolve the claim through counsel or maintain adequate reserves while the dispute continued. His neutrality made the documents more useful, not less. The same afternoon, Angela finished the objection draft, Ryan called me. I almost did not answer because I had nothing left to give anyone emotionally, but his voicemail started before I could decide. Megan, it's Ryan. I'm not calling about the estate. Call me when you can. I waited until I was home. Ryan answered immediately. His voice sounded flat. I moved some money. I sat down at my kitchen table. What do you mean? Our joint operating account. I moved my direct deposits and the amount that was clearly mine into a separate account. I left enough for shared bills until we sort things out. I did not respond right away, because I did not know what response belonged to me. Ryan continued. I'm staying somewhere else for a while. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm not saying it's my fault. Good. Because it isn't. I looked at Dad's key, which I had brought home from work and left beside the fruit bowl. What happened? Ryan exhaled. I asked her for a complete list of what she owes personally and what the business still owes. I waited. She gave me 3 different numbers. I closed my eyes. Ryan said the first number excluded obligations Lauren considered old business stuff. The second included some personal guarantees, but not a credit line. The third came after he showed her statements he had already seen. He did not send me documents, and I did not ask. Those were his finances and his marriage. He told me only what he had personally done and heard. I kept asking one question, he said. What do we actually owe? And? She kept answering a different one. What she thinks we can manage. I knew that move. Ryan gave a short, exhausted laugh. I finally understood why you keep correcting words. I wouldn't recommend making it a lifestyle. I'm serious. So am I. He told me he was not filing for divorce. He was not asking my opinion about whether he should. He simply would not co-sign new debt, rely on the house, or merge additional money with Lauren until he understood the full financial picture. I'm telling you because she's going to say you did this, he said. She already thinks I did. Then don't let her convince you. I won't. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Megan, whatever happens between me and Lauren is between me and Lauren. That's what I've been saying. I know, I should have listened sooner. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table, thinking about how consequences moved. I had not told Ryan to leave. Daniel had not ordered him to separate finances. No court had ruled against Lauren. Nothing had legally resolved yet. Ryan had simply asked his wife for numbers and discovered that every answer changed when he pushed one layer deeper. That was when I understood Lauren's problem was larger than Dad's house. She had become so accustomed to deciding which version of reality other people could handle that she no longer seemed to recognize the difference between managing a story and managing the truth. 2 days later, Lauren asked to meet me privately. We chose Dad's house because neither of us wanted an audience. I had written permission to enter for the meeting because the property still belonged to the estate, a detail Lauren found insulting, and I found necessary. She arrived before me and was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. For the first time since the wedding, she did not look polished or furious. She looked exhausted. There were no flowers, no white dress, no carefully arranged family photograph behind her. Just my younger sister in an old sweater with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she had not touched. "You filed it," she said. Angela prepared the objection. "You're asking to remove me. We're asking you to correct the administration. If you won't, yes, we're asking for a neutral administrator." Lauren looked down. "Do you know what that does to me?" "I know what it does to the estate. That's exactly what I mean." She looked up sharply. "You can turn everything into process. I'm trying very hard not to turn it into anything else." She rubbed both hands over her face. "If this becomes a court fight, everyone is going to know." "Know what?" "That I screwed up." I nearly said they already knew. I stopped myself. Lauren continued. "My marriage is barely 2 weeks old and Ryan moved out. The family thinks we're destroying Dad's estate. Now you want to file something saying I can't even manage it." I felt sympathy. I hated that I felt it, because sympathy had been the doorway our family used for years to move responsibility from one person to another. "I don't want to humiliate you," I said. "You recorded my wedding toast. You poured wine on me to get me out of a room so you could define my signature for a ballroom full of people." Her face tightened. "That was one stupid night." I leaned forward. "Then why did you keep doing it after Monday?" Lauren stopped. "That's the part you keep avoiding," I continued. "Daniel told you the claims still existed. You kept treating it like I would eventually forgive it. Angela rejected the settlement. You still instructed the accounting as if forgiveness was coming. You were warned again. You kept planning the house around money the estate had not resolved. I thought you would come around. That is not administration. I know you. No. You knew the version of me that made this easier." Lauren's eyes filled, though she did not cry. "I'm asking you now. Withdraw it. Correct the accounting. If I do that, the house is gone. You don't know that yet. I do. No. You know keeping it becomes harder when the estate uses real numbers. That's the same thing." "It isn't." She stood abruptly and walked toward the sink. "Dad wanted me to have this house. Maybe he did. You keep saying maybe, because he never told me you were entitled to keep it regardless of every debt attached to it." Lauren turned around. "He loved me." I stared at her. "I know. He wanted me okay. I know that too. You say it like it was a problem." I looked at the same kitchen where Dad had once admitted that my competence made things easy for him. Sometimes the way he kept you okay became a problem for everyone else. Lauren flinched as if I had struck her. I regretted the cruelty in the wording, but not the truth underneath it. She said, "You think this is all my fault?" "No." That answer surprised her. "Dad made choices," I said. "I made choices. You made choices. I signed away an inheritance because I wanted a clean ending. That was mine. Dad borrowed against the house to protect you, and hid how much that affected his finances. That was his. You kept assuming the debt to me would disappear because I could afford to let it go. That part is yours." Lauren sat down again. For a while neither of us spoke. Then she asked, "What do you want me to do? Listen to your lawyer?" She laughed bitterly. "That's what Megan Walker says at the emotional climax. This isn't a movie." "No, apparently it's probate." Despite everything, I almost smiled. The next morning, Angela called with a proposal from Lauren's attorney. Rather than contest a full removal request, Lauren could voluntarily resign as personal representative. A neutral successor would take over the estate. The accounting would be corrected. My claim would be independently reviewed through the estate process. The question of additional administrative costs caused by the dispute would remain reserved for proper settlement or court approval. No public accusation of theft. No demand that I reclaim my inheritance. No theatrical victory. It was exactly the outcome I had said I wanted. Do you agree? Angela asked. Yes. That quickly? I want the estate administered correctly. I don't need Lauren punished in a courtroom. Angela said the resignation documents would go to Lauren for signature. That afternoon, Lauren asked me to meet at her attorney's office before she decided. Angela came with me. The lawyers spoke first. Terms, transition, records, neutral successor. There was nothing dramatic about any of it until Lauren reached the final signature page. Her pen stopped above the line. She looked at me. If I sign this, she said, I lose Dad's house. I felt the old pull to make the moment easier for her. To promise more than I could promise. To turn uncertainty into comfort because she was scared. And I knew how to survive discomfort better. Then I remembered Dad's last warning. Do not confuse exhaustion with consent. I met Lauren's eyes. No, I said. You lose the right to decide what happens to it by yourself. Her pen remained above the paper. Lauren signed the resignation. She did not make a speech. She did not throw the pen or accuse me of stealing her birthright in front of the lawyers. She looked at the signature line for so long that I began to wonder whether she was going to change her mind, then finally lowered the pen and wrote her name. When she finished, she slid the papers toward her attorney and sat back without looking at me. I felt no rush of victory. Mostly I felt the strange stillness that comes when something you have spent weeks preparing to fight ends with the scratch of a pen. The resignation still had to move through the probate process. It was not as if Lauren signed at noon and a stranger took Dad's house keys at 12:05. Her attorney submitted the paperwork, the transition was accepted, and a neutral successor administrator was appointed to finish the estate. Daniel transferred the legal file and continued handling matters appropriate to estate counsel. Angela kept representing me as a creditor. For the first time since Dad died, the person making administrative decisions about his property had no childhood bedroom in the house, no argument with me from Christmas 10 years earlier, and no business plan depending on what the equity might become. Lauren told relatives I had forced her out. I corrected that statement once. She resigned on advice of counsel, rather than fight over whether a neutral administrator was necessary. Aunt Denise said, That sounds like forcing her out with more words. I told her she was welcome to prefer the shorter version, but I was not going to argue about it. There was another issue involving the additional professional costs the dispute had created. Lauren had resisted correcting the accounting after repeated notice. Outside counsel had become necessary, and the transition itself created administrative expense. Angela warned me not to expect some dramatic order making Lauren pay every legal bill because she had behaved badly. That was not how it worked. Instead, the parties addressed a defined portion of the additional administration costs attributable to the disputed handling, and the final allocation remained subject to proper approval through the estate process. The practical result was simple. Some of those extra costs would reduce what Lauren eventually received rather than being spread as though they had arisen from ordinary administration. I did not receive that money. It did not increase Dad's debt to me. Nobody handed me Lauren's punishment in a check. That mattered because by then I had learned how quickly revenge stories became dishonest if every consequence somehow enriched the person telling them. The neutral administrator's first useful contribution was not emotional. It was arithmetic. Dad's house appraised at roughly $520,000. The first mortgage still carried about $88,000. The home equity line was around $118,000. My allowed creditor claim, after accounting for Dad's payments before his death and the agreed calculation under the note, was a little over $83,000. Then there were ordinary estate expenses, property carrying costs, professional fees, and eventual transaction costs if the house had to be sold. Lauren had spent months talking about equity as though it were a number printed on the front door. The neutral administrator treated equity the way a bank did. What was the property worth? What was secured against it? What obligations had to be satisfied? What cash would remain after the estate actually paid what it owed? Lauren still wanted to keep the house. Nobody prohibited her from trying. The administrator gave her a reasonable opportunity to demonstrate that she could fund the retention without asking the estate to pretend its liabilities did not exist. That was where her plan finally met numbers she could not edit. To keep the property, Lauren would need financing large enough to deal with the existing mortgage and home equity debt, while also putting sufficient money into the estate to resolve my claim and the other obligations that could not simply be transferred into her name. Depending on closing adjustments and reserves, the financing requirement was roughly $300,000, potentially somewhat more. On paper, that was not an absurd mortgage for a $520,000 house. For Lauren, it was. Her documented self-employment income was around $60,000 a year. Her personal and lingering business obligations totaled close to $50,000, with monthly non-housing payments running well over $1,300 before anyone added property taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance, or a new mortgage payment. The business she wanted to restart did not count as future guaranteed income simply because she believed in it. The lender did not need to hate Lauren. Arithmetic was enough. She could not comfortably qualify for the amount required on her own. The obvious solution was Ryan. For months, that had always been the hidden support underneath Lauren's plan. His income was steadier. His credit profile was stronger. Together, they had a realistic path to a refinance that Lauren alone did not. Ryan refused to co-sign. I learned that from him, not from Lauren. He called me after the financing discussion and said, "She asked me again." I knew what he meant. About the house? About signing with her. And I said no. I was careful with my next question. Because of the loan issue? No. Ryan sounded tired but no longer confused. Because every time I ask what we owe, the answer changes depending on what she wants me to agree to. I said nothing. He continued. First, the old business obligations didn't count because they were basically handled. Then the credit line didn't count because she planned to pay it after the refinance. Then your father's debt didn't count because you supposedly weren't going to collect. I'm done signing my name under numbers that change after I ask questions. Whatever you do with your marriage is between you two. I know. He told me he had followed through on what he mentioned earlier. His paycheck now went into his own account. He had moved into a furnished apartment on a short-term lease rather than continuing to stay with friends. He had not filed for divorce. He had not hired someone to destroy Lauren financially. He had simply stopped allowing their marriage to function as automatic collateral for plans he did not trust. Before we ended the call, Ryan said, "For what it's worth, I don't think the house caused this." I waited. The house just made me look at the numbers. That was the closest he ever came to blaming Lauren directly in a conversation with me. A week later, Lauren asked me to meet at Dad's house. The neutral administrator had allowed the meeting because Lauren needed to remove a few clearly identified personal items before the property moved toward sale preparation. I arrived after her and found her sitting on the back steps. It was warm by then, late enough in the year that the trees behind Dad's yard had filled out completely. The place looked different from the house I had entered in March under a gray sky. I wondered how many versions of one building a person could carry at once. Lauren did not bother with small talk. "Ryan won't sign," I heard. Her head snapped toward me. "Of course you did. He called me. You two talk a lot now." "Not really." She looked away. Then she said, "I could keep it if I had a little more cash going in." I felt something in me tighten. "How much?" She gave me a number. It was not 40,000 this time. It was more. Not enough to erase every financing problem, but enough that, combined with a smaller loan structure and adjustments to what she would need at closing, she believed she might have another chance at approval. I looked at her. Lauren looked back. Neither of us said the obvious thing for several seconds. Finally, she did. "You could loan it to me." I almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny. Because after everything that had happened, the symmetry was so precise it felt cruel. Dad had once sat across from me and asked for a loan because he wanted to keep that house. Now Lauren was asking me to lend her money so she could keep the same house after refusing for months to honor the loan Dad had already made me. She saw my expression and became defensive immediately. I'd sign paperwork. That isn't the problem. I'd pay interest. That isn't the problem either. You loaned Dad $92,000. Yes. You can afford this. I looked toward the yard where Mom used to grow tomatoes against the fence. There it was again. Not whether I wanted to lend her the money. Not whether I trusted the risk. Not whether the decision made financial sense. I could afford it. Therefore, the possibility existed. Therefore, she was entitled to ask until my refusal sounded selfish. I turned back to her. That has never been the same thing as you having a right to it. Lauren's face hardened. I didn't say I had a right to it. You keep using my ability to survive a loss as the first argument for why I should take one. I'm asking for a loan. No. You didn't even think about it. I already did. When? For the last 3 years. She stood. That doesn't even make sense. It does to me. I reminded her that when her first business failed, she had asked me for money. I reviewed her plan and said no. Dad stepped in instead. The cost eventually landed against his house. Then Dad borrowed from me to stabilize the financial pressure surrounding that house. After he died, Lauren expected me to forgive the remaining debt. When I refused, she asked for $40,000 of it anyway. Now that the estate was finally using real numbers, she wanted me to create another loan so she could keep the property. I'm not entering that circle again, I said. Lauren looked like she wanted to click, but for once there was no new version of the numbers available. She asked, So you're just going to watch Dad's house get sold to strangers? I looked at the back door. The same door I had opened when Dad called because a pipe froze. The same kitchen window where Mom used to tap the glass when she wanted us to come inside. The house mattered. That was something I had spent too long pretending it did not. I'm going to be sad when it sells, I said. Lauren blinked. I'm going to hate seeing someone else own it. I'm going to remember Mom in the kitchen and Dad falling asleep in front of football games. I'm probably going to cry after closing, then help me keep it. That isn't the same thing. She laughed bitterly. Of course it isn't. Nothing is ever the same thing with you. No, because feelings and obligations are different things. I can love this house and still refuse to finance your ownership of it. Lauren went inside without answering. The neutral administrator listed the property in July. It was not a fire sale. The house was cleaned, minor deferred issues were addressed where appropriate. Lauren complained that the list price was too low, then complained that accepting less than the highest imaginable number would disrespect Dad. The administrator listened, reviewed the market information, and continued doing the job. An offer came from a family with 2 children. I did not meet them during a sentimental open house scene. That would have been too convenient even for my life. I learned about them through the administrator's summary when the offer arrived. Financing verified. Inspection requested. No bizarre conditions. The kind of buyers estate professionals liked because they appeared capable of actually closing. Their offer was not perfect. It was reasonable. Lauren objected. The administrator negotiated. The buyers improved it. A few days later, the estate accepted. When Angela called to tell me, I was at work. I thanked her, closed my office door, and sat quietly for several minutes. I had insisted for months that I did not want Dad's house. I had been telling the truth. The grief still surprised me. I imagined the kitchen table leaving someday. Someone repainting Dad's bedroom. Children running through the yard without knowing which tree Lauren had fallen out of when she was 9, or where Mom once buried a dog we were both convinced deserved a funeral with flowers. For the first time, I understood the difference Dad had tried to explain before he died. Letting something go did not require pretending it had never mattered. The accepted offer moved the story toward an ending. None of us could undo with another family meeting. Lauren found me outside Angela's office after a routine estate update 2 days later. She had apparently waited by the elevators. She looked smaller somehow, though nothing about her body had changed. The offer is going through, she said. Yes. Ryan still won't come home. I did not answer. My business plan is dead. I stayed quiet. She studied my face as if searching for something. Then she asked, Are you happy now? The answer came easily. No. Lauren stared at me. Then what was the point? Lauren's question followed me all the way home. Are you happy now? Then what was the point? I understood why she asked it. From where she stood, revenge was supposed to end with satisfaction. I was supposed to look at the accepted offer on Dad's house, at her abandoned business plan, at Ryan living somewhere else, and finally feel that everything had balanced. For a while, I had imagined I might. The night she poured wine down my dress, I wanted her embarrassed. When I heard her tell the maid of honor to wait until I was gone, I wanted to catch her doing whatever she thought my absence made possible. When I heard 200 people applaud while she turned my inheritance disclaimer into proof that every financial obligation Dad had to me had disappeared, I wanted to walk back into that ballroom and make her explain herself in front of everyone. But months later, standing outside Angela's office while Lauren asked what any of it had accomplished, I no longer wanted an audience. The point wasn't watching you lose, I said. Lauren folded her arms. That's convenient. I thought it might be. She looked at me sharply. I continued. After the wedding, I thought seeing your plan collapse would make what you did feel smaller. It doesn't. Then what was the point? The point was making sure you couldn't keep doing it. Lauren gave a short laugh. Doing what? Deciding what other people can afford to lose. Her expression hardened. You did it with Dad, I said. Dad did it with me. Then you did it with me because you learned that if I could survive a cost, somebody could put it on my side of the ledger. You're still blaming me for what Dad chose. No. I'm finally separating what belongs to each of us. She shook her head. You always have an answer. No. I spent most of this year learning I didn't. For once, she let me continue. Dad chose to rescue your business. He chose to borrow against the house. He chose not to tell me the whole reason his finances had become unstable when he later asked me for help. Those choices were his. I chose to make him the loan. I chose to sign away my inheritance because I wanted out of the fight over the house. Those choices were mine. And mine? You chose to assume Dad's debt to me would disappear because you thought I wouldn't make you deal with it. Lauren looked away. I could have stopped there. Instead, I said, You could have stopped. She turned back. When? December, when you got my creditor claim. January, when I signed the disclaimer, and you knew those were different things. Before the wedding. After Daniel warned you. After Angela rejected the settlement. After your own lawyer told you to correct the accounting. Pick one. Lauren's mouth tightened. You could have stopped too. I nodded. Yes. That answer surprised her. I could have forgiven the debt, I said. I could have lent you more money. I could have withdrawn the objection when you asked. I could have kept rescuing the outcome. Lauren stared at me. So could you, I said. There was nothing else to argue about after that. The house closed on August 7th. The closing itself was less dramatic than everything that had led to it. There were no relatives outside holding signs, no judge reading a punishment into the record, no final confrontation in Dad's driveway. The buyers signed their documents. The estate signed its side. The mortgage and home equity line were paid from the proceeds. Closing costs and the property expenses that had accumulated during administration were accounted for. My allowed creditor claim was paid according to the promissory note and the final estate figures. When the wire hit my account, I did not feel rich. I felt tired. The amount was slightly more than $83,000 after the agreed calculation under Dad's note. It was money I had once transferred out of my own savings because my father sat across from me at his kitchen table and asked for a loan. He had paid part of it back himself, month by month. The estate paid the rest. That distinction mattered to me. I did not receive half the house. I did not undo my disclaimer. I did not take Lauren's inheritance. Once Dad's debts, the secured loans, estate expenses, transaction costs, and the additional approved administration costs were handled, whatever remained under the will passed according to the estate plan I had already chosen not to participate in. Lauren received the residual inheritance she was entitled to receive after my disclaimer. It was simply far less than the version she had announced at her wedding. The house had never been a $520,000 prize waiting for her name. It had been a $520,000 property carrying almost $206,000 in secured debt, an additional valid obligation to me, and all the normal costs involved in settling an estate. Lauren had built a future using gross value. Probate forced her to live with net value. The additional professional costs caused by the disputed administration did not all disappear into some magical punishment account either. A defined portion was allocated through the estate process based on the work her resistance had created. And that reduced what ultimately reached her. Angela warned me again that it was not a fine for being a bad sister. I understood. I did not need the legal system to call Lauren a villain. I needed it to stop treating her preferred outcome as more important than the numbers. Ryan did not move back home before the closing. He called me once that week, mostly because he wanted me to know he had no intention of interfering with the sale. He had remained financially separate from Lauren and still would not co-sign any refinance or business debt. He did not tell me he was filing for divorce, and I did not ask. Their marriage belonged to them. Whatever happened next would take longer than the estate and would not be decided by one dramatic conversation. He said something before we hung up that stayed with me. I used to think trust meant believing someone until you caught them lying. What do you think now? That trust means knowing they won't make you investigate them to get the whole truth. I did not know what to say to that, so I told him I hoped he figured out what he needed. He said, "I'm trying." That was enough. Lauren and I met once more at Dad's house before closing. The administrator had arranged the final removal of personal property. Most of what remained was ordinary kitchen items. A lamp Dad refused to replace, even though the shade leaned permanently to one side. Boxes of photographs neither Lauren nor I wanted strangers sorting through. Some tools. A stack of Christmas decorations Mom had labeled in handwriting that hit me harder than I expected. Lauren took more than I did. That would once have irritated me. Now I let her. I chose Mom's recipe cards, one framed photograph of Dad in his 20s, and a chipped blue mug he used every morning despite owning several nicer ones. None of it was worth much money. All of it mattered. Lauren watched me put the mug into a box. "You really don't want anything else?" I looked around the living room. "No." She nodded toward the dining set. "You fought me over that in December." "I remember. And now you don't care?" "I care." She frowned. I smiled slightly. "I finally figured out those aren't opposites." Lauren looked toward the dining room. For a moment, I saw the sister I had grown up with, rather than the bride who poured wine on me or the personal representative who had tried to bend an estate around her plans. She said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." It would have been easy to tell her. That was another thing I had learned about myself. Give me a problem and I could produce steps before most people finished explaining it. Reduce expenses. Rebuild credit. Stop trying to restart the business until the old obligations were fully understood. Get counseling with Ryan if he wanted it. Find steady work. Make a 3-year plan. I knew exactly what I would do if I were Lauren. For the first time in my life, I understood. That did not mean she had asked me to do it for her. So I said, "I don't know." She looked almost offended. "You always know." "No, I usually have an opinion." That's basically the same thing. It really isn't. Lauren sat on the arm of Dad's old chair. "I'm renting a smaller place." I nodded. "I picked up more project work." "That sounds sensible." She gave me a look. "You're trying very hard not to say good." "I am." That almost made her smile. Then the smile disappeared. "I hate you a little." "I know. Do you hate me?" I thought about it. At the wedding, yes. For 20 minutes after that toast, absolutely. During the worst parts of probate, sometimes. But hate had become exhausting long before the house sold. "No," I said, "I don't trust you." Lauren looked down. "That's worse." "Maybe. Will you ever?" "I don't know." She nodded slowly. I was proud of myself for not turning uncertainty into a promise just because it hurt her. Before I left, Lauren followed me into the kitchen. The oak table was still there. The scar from the cast-iron pan was still visible near one corner. For years, Dad had refused to sand it out because, as he liked to say, Furniture should admit a family had lived around it. Lauren touched the mark. Do you think Dad knew this would happen? No. He warned you about me. He warned me about myself. She looked at me. I told her about the last conversation I had remembered. Clearly only after all of this began. Dad telling me not to make decisions because I was tired. Telling me I sometimes decided things were not worth wanting because walking away felt cleaner than defending them. Lauren listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "He never said things like that to me." I almost answered, "He had different things to say to you." Instead, I said, "He probably should have." That was as close as we came to forgiveness. 3 days after the closing, I drove past Dad's house once. I told myself I happened to be in the neighborhood. That was a lie, but a harmless one. There was another car in the driveway. A bicycle lay on the grass near the garage. Through the front window, I could see moving boxes stacked against a wall. The buyers had already begun turning our family home into somebody else's home. I sat in my car across the street, longer than I intended. Then I noticed the brass key in my cup holder. I had forgotten to surrender it. For months, I had carried that key everywhere. At first because Dad needed me to have it. Then because probate was open. Then because it became a piece of him I was not ready to stop carrying. I drove to the administrator's office. The receptionist told me they could dispose of it because the locks were being changed anyway. I could have kept it. Nobody would have cared. Instead, I placed it on the counter. "That was my father's," I said. She nodded. "Do you want it back as a keepsake?" I looked at the key. For most of my adult life, it had meant that when something went wrong at that house, someone could call me and I would come. A leaking pipe, an insurance form, a broken furnace, a frightened father, a sister in trouble, a family consequence nobody else wanted to carry. "No," I said. I left it there. Walking back to my car, I thought about Dad's sentence one last time. Make sure you're walking away because you're done. Not because everybody else made staying expensive. For once, I knew the difference. I had not walked away from my inheritance because it meant nothing. I had walked away because I did not want ownership of the house. I had not enforced Dad's loan because I needed revenge. I had enforced it because generosity was supposed to remain a choice, and nobody else had the right to choose my sacrifice for me. Lauren lost the house. She lost control of the estate. She lost the business plan she had built on equity that never truly existed in the form she imagined. For the time being, she also lost the certainty that Ryan would keep building a future with her. I did not give those consequences to her. I simply stopped removing them. That was the part my family had taken the longest to understand. Being strong enough to save someone from the consequences of their choices does not mean you are obligated to do it. Sometimes the wisest thing you can give the people you love is help. Sometimes it is money. Sometimes it is another chance. And sometimes it is finally stepping aside and letting the bill arrive in the right person's name. When you are the capable one in a family, people may start treating your strength as permission to place their burdens on you. You should remember that being able to afford a loss does not mean you owe that loss to someone else. Help should always be a choice, not an expectation. Put important loans, agreements, and financial responsibilities in writing, even with people you love, because clear boundaries protect relationships as much as they protect money. You can care about your family without rescuing them from every consequence they create. You can also walk away from something meaningful without pretending it never mattered. Most importantly, do not let guilt decide what you give up. Make decisions because they are right for you, not because someone made saying no uncomfortable. If stories like this help you recognize unhealthy family patterns and stronger boundaries, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more.